Hi, everyone. Welcome to Design TV by SANDOW. I'm Avi Rajagopal, Editor-in-Chief of Metropolis. And today we're celebrating Metropolis's 40th anniversary. Yep, that's 4 decades of support from all of you, our readers, our viewers, our followers, advertisers, and other well-wishers. A big thank you to all of you from the Metropolis team. Metropolis was founded in 1981 with a very simple mission: to explain why our cities, buildings, spaces, and objects look the way they do and work the way they do. Over the years, we've expanded that mission to ask, what should architecture and design be? What are the ideas that we should all be paying attention to today so we can build the future world that we want to live in? A world in harmony that is inclusive and just to people, where everyone has the right to healthy and nurturing places to live, work, play, learn, and grow. Today, we have comments and conversations with some incredible people who are at the forefront of design practice. First up, Edward Mazria, the founder and CEO of Architecture 2030, tells us what we need to do to address the biggest challenge we face today, the climate crisis.
So the first thing, there was a saying by a very famous baseball catcher: if you don't know where you are going, you'll end up someplace else. We don't want to end up someplace else, and I'll tell you why. The difference between 1.5 degrees C planetary warming, which you hear a lot about, and 2 degrees C are two very different futures. And that difference is dramatic. If we go from 1.5 to 2, if we don't meet the 1.5 and we go to 2, 1.7 billion more people will be exposed to severe heat waves every 5 years. 100 to 400 million more people would be at risk for hunger. 1 to 2 billion more people, so this is going from 1.5 to 2, will no longer have adequate water, and 1 billion people may be forced to migrate, something we don't want to happen. So we need to stay at the 1.5. We know what the issue is: it's burning fossil fuels and putting CO2 in the atmosphere. The carbon budget for 1.5 is 340 gigatons. That's how much we have left. Today, we put out about 40 gigatons globally of CO2. You've all heard about peaking emissions now and phasing out in 2050. That's 600 gigatons. That gives us less than a 50% probability of staying under 2 degrees. So we've essentially lost a good 5 to 10 years in terms of getting at this issue. Now, the Biden administration is calling for a 50% reduction by 2030. If you follow that line straight down, they're calling for phasing out by 2050, but if you follow that line straight down, they phase out by 2040. That's 400 gigatons, getting us real close to the 340 and a much better than 50% chance of meeting the 1.5. To actually meet the 1.5 with a high probability, we need a 65% and a phase out by 2040. So the Biden administration is actually on target, because every 5 years when there's another COP, they increase their ambition. All countries are expected to increase their ambition in 2025 and in 2030 again. So we should see that curve drop. So we think we will be in good shape, at least the US, and we think the rest of the world will follow. So can we meet the 1.5? How hard is this? And, people are saying, it's very difficult, it's too difficult, maybe we passed it. Well, in the built environment, which is responsible for most of the emissions, so we are a majority of emissions globally, it's the built environment. It consists of 3 things: new buildings, existing buildings, and then materials and construction. So let's say, what do we have to do for new buildings? Well, we just have to put in place zero carbon code standards. It's as simple as that, and we now have them. So we have a zero code. The IECC adopted the zero code and put it into the 2021 IECC. China just developed a zero code, and the European Commission directed all the countries to begin implementing a zero code this year. So we're starting to see that happen. We just need to get it adopted very, very quickly. What is a zero code? It's a no-brainer. You take the existing building code standard. All the new standards are really efficient. They're very good. You take that, you design an efficient building, you go even further using passive systems and all sorts of things, daylighting, if you need to, and then, or if you want to, and then address the remaining buildings needs with on-site renewables, and you get as much as you can. And if you can't, then you go to off-site. But that off-site has to be attributed to your building. You do that, you're at zero carbon. You can go to zero-code.org and read all about that. What about existing buildings? There are trillions of existing buildings out there. How are we going to get all those to zero? Well, it's a no-brainer. You do efficiency where you can. You electrify, get rid of the natural gas on site or the heating oil. You electrify the buildings and you produce that electricity with renewables. The great thing about the administration now is they want to go to a clean grid by 2035. So the country is moving. And we've discovered something really interesting to get at all the buildings. How do we get all the buildings? Well, in New York, about 2% of buildings are over 50,000 square feet, a little bit more than 2%. But they're located in three areas: Midtown, Lower Manhattan, and downtown Brooklyn. And that small number of buildings, there are 1 million buildings in New York. This is only 26,000 of them, are responsible for almost half of all New York City's emissions, about 2%. We see that in every single major city in the world. You can see in Chicago, the big buildings along the waterfront, and then miles of small buildings. Look at Philadelphia, the same thing. If you look at Los Angeles, you see downtown LA, big, big buildings, and then miles and miles of small buildings. Same thing in Sydney, Australia, same thing in Guangzhou, China, same thing in Istanbul, Turkey. So 50% of the emissions are produced by these very, very, very big buildings. So how do we create policies? Well, we first create an existing buildings policy. Whoops. And so the first thing we have to do is establish an emissions threshold in floor area and square meters or square feet of big buildings responsible for about 50% of building sector emissions. You go from the largest buildings down. When you hit 50%, that's the threshold. You require them, you establish a policy and you require them to get to zero carbon by 2030. You give them 9 years to do it. People who own these huge buildings have the wherewithal to do it and have the financing and the money to do it. But you provide incentives for them to do it. And for those who don't, you provide more incentives. Everything from fast track permitting, low interest loans, tax abatements, all the way to equipment discounts, going from boilers, gas boilers to heat pumps. How do you get it to all these other buildings? Well, to establish a policy for the millions of small buildings, you require the same thing. Only you require them at building intervention points, a zoning or use change. When you go in, you get to zero carbon. Point of renovation, at point of sale. So if you're selling a building, the new owner has to so you get lots of buildings converted very quickly. You do those two things, and you get at the entire existing building sector. The beautiful thing about that is if you renovate a building, you're less likely to demolish it, and that saves a huge amount of embodied carbon. Now let's talk about embodied carbon. So this is materials, construction, and infrastructure. There are literally millions of materials to choose from when designing a building or building a building. How do we get a handle on all these millions of materials? Well, if you look at industry, it's responsible for 43% of all global emissions. And that's everything. That's spoons and forks and dishes and eyeglasses and your phone and all the building materials and enclosure and systems and lighting and plumbing and everything. All that falls into industry. How do we get a handle on that? It seems daunting, but we reshape the pie, and all of a sudden, two materials, concrete and steel, are responsible for 50% of all industrial emissions. It's the same as big buildings, small buildings. So if we get a handle on those two right away, we have to 2040 to get carbon out of all the rest of the materials worldwide, and we can start on that. So that sounds really now doable. So now what do we do? Well, the first thing we have to do is change the conversation. If we don't know about it, then we're not going to do anything. Well, mainstream media has picked it up. Concrete, the most destructive material on earth. Steel makers, next in the crosshairs as climate pressure grows. These two industries are feeling huge amount of pressure, and they're not sitting still now. And I'll tell you why in a minute. But all of a sudden, zero carbon cement, is that possible? All of a sudden, we're seeing, yes, we know that we can do that. US Steel aims to achieve net zero by 2050. They're 10 years too late, but we'll push them to do it sooner. But you're starting to see movement now. And why? Because mass timber is giving them heartburn, because it's an alternative. And we're starting to see many of our firms go to mass timber for structure and things like that, and they lose market share. And so you're seeing a little bit of a war going on, but it's healthy, and it's driving everyone to lower emissions. So what can you do as architects, designers, planners? The greenest building, of course, is one that's already built. So renovate, repurpose, reuse materials. That saves a huge amount of energy and emissions. Land use boundaries, infill. We know that densification is not a COVID spreader. You can specify low carbon materials. There's all sorts of tools out there now, and more coming on the line. Very, very exciting. And policies are beginning to now take shape. Or you can substitute and use a glue laminated timber. Glue laminated bamboo all of a sudden is beginning to take off in the global south. Sequestering carbon in concrete through aggregate and injection, biomaterials, and let's not forget landscapes and soil and urban agriculture actually drawing down. So can we meet the 1.5? This was 1891. This is Toronto. That's what it looked like. All three-story buildings, masonry walls, very small rooms. You had to go wall to wall with structure. This is what it looks like today. That was in 2010. You see all these skyscrapers. They could be anywhere in the world. Same thing has happened everywhere. So how did all that take place, and how long did it take to transform the built environment? Well, the first modern building was in Germany in 1925. It's considered the first one, was the Bauhaus, where structure moved inside. You had columns now rather than masonry walls. So now you can hang the exterior wall, bring light in, open up the floor plan, and create large interior spaces. That was in 1925. What was going on in 1925? It's pretty primitive. We didn't even have a transatlantic call till 27, no television, and we had the Model T truck. So that was back then. That's when it all started in 1925. Conditions were really bad in Europe, and all the architects and planners of the day got together in Europe and created a modern movement, essentially, and they created guidelines for essentially utopian reform, environmental reform, function-based zones, get the housing out of the cold and industrial areas, high-rise housing blocks, solar exposure. And Le Corbusier laid out his principles, moving columns inside, hanging walls. That all took place beginning in 1928. By 32, it made its way over to the US, and we had the international style at the Museum of Modern Art. Buildings can be built anywhere because we can climate control them. We had the beautiful Johnson Wax building by 39, and then by 49, by 52, Skidmore did the Lever House, single glass building, beautiful building in downtown New York, structure moved inside, and the world changed. So between 1925 and 1952 was only 27 years. And we made that transformation with these tools. No computer. We didn't even have an ink pen. Ink pen, we didn't even get an ink pen to draw with until 1960. You had to scrape off the ink. You had to scrape off the ink off your drawings. It took a year and a half to do a set of construction documents. And think what we can do today. The first laptop didn't come into 1991. Solar is now the cheapest electricity in history around the world. And this is where we are now. The US building sector has been dropping its emissions since 2005. Since 2005, we had not increased our energy consumption in the entire building sector. In the US, we've dropped it about 5%, and we've reduced our emissions by 30% already to 2020. And if Biden makes good on the clean grid by 2035, we will be down about 70%, because look how much electricity the building sector uses by the year 2030, and we should easily phase out by 2040. This is the success story that we hope to take in to the UN climate change meeting in Glasgow in November. So can we meet the 1.5 degrees carbon budget? Of course we can. Thank you.
Ed is always an inspiration. He was first profiled in Metropolis in 2003 and was named a Metropolis game changer in 2013. But the climate crisis, is not just about rising temperatures. It is about the well-being of all people around the world. It's about bringing justice to those who are the most vulnerable. Next up, we have two other Metropolis game changers, our Metropolis game changers from 2020, in a conversation about how architecture can be a tool for social justice, especially in housing. Here are 3D printing startup Icon and South African architect Kevin Kimwella in conversation with our senior editor, Kelly Beamon.
My name is Kelly Beamon. I'm a senior editor for the magazine. And today I'd like people to meet all of you because you're with two very exciting practices, I think. One is Icon, and correct me, Alex and Dimitri, if I get any of this incorrect. It's a construction technologies company in Austin, Texas, that's making 3D printed houses. And you guys today are represented by one of the co-founders, Alex LaRue, and the company's director of operations, Dimitri Julius. Our other exciting firm is that of South African-based architect Kevin Kimwella, who builds critical structures, in my opinion, including schools with a variety of found or cast-off materials that would normally, I think, be headed to landfills. To start our talk, I just would like to hear what I'm thinking is that the two different practices have what you have in common is using innovative construction methods in the service of underserved communities. Everyone here, I think, has plenty to say, possibly. I get from what I've seen about the passion that drives them to develop these unique building methods. And I'd like to hear why you've chosen to focus on the specific communities that you do, but also how you came to this point. Maybe we could start off with the story of how each of these firms began.
Yeah, absolutely. Kevin, do you want to go first?
All right. I studied architecture, and I was happily practicing normal mainstream architecture, but I did this overland trip through Africa, and I guess I was also discovering myself. And in doing this trip, I came across a lot of marginalized communities or poor marginalized communities between Nairobi, Kenya, and Port Elizabeth in South Africa. And I kept wondering what I could do about them. Is this something we could do as designers or architects, especially when you see that most of the design and mainstream architecture is geared towards communities that can afford it. And I started just digging up about social innovation, design for community, design for communities that cannot afford architects. And what began slowly as a discovery and exploration ended up eventually being something that I had to get into full time, because at that stage, there was very little, especially within my community of practitioners, very little known. And it kind of felt as though these communities were forgotten. So that's how I got into it. The beginning of it was just bit by bit, and discovering myself as I discovered this new architecture, building faith and hope and trust and connections and networks, and eventually it's grown over the past couple of years to be something quite remarkable, I think.
That's great.
How about you guys?
Sure, I can give the story here. So we've got three co-founders here at Icon: Jason, Evan, and myself. I'm the CTO as well, so I have kind of a technology slant to this. But I started about 6 years ago looking at the way small plastic 3D printers worked. You might have seen these before. You can print all sorts of little gizmos and gadgets. They're pretty cool little machines. But very quickly I realized I thought the technology was untapped, that there was more that we could do with these little machines, if only we changed a few little things. I thought if we made the machines a lot bigger, and if we use a little bit of a different material, perhaps there were new things we could print or do. And so that's exactly what I did. I just started experimenting with bigger machines. I went literally into the backyard and built the biggest frame for a 3D printer that I could possibly build. That was about 10 feet by 10 feet by 10 feet. I'm still pretty proud of it. It wasn't pretty, but I'm still proud of it. And eventually extruded, or better word for extrude is to like squeeze, like you might squeeze paste out of a thing of toothpaste, and was able to create a little structure. And that was enough for me to think that there was something here, that maybe this could be perfected and improved upon until there was like a final product here. And so that led me on a 5 to 6 year kind of journey to get to where we are today, which is now 3D printed 16 homes in Mexico and in Texas for all sorts of different customers. A lot of people in underserved communities, as well as what we call middle market housing here in the United States. So these are houses, 300,000 to 500,000 or so in price point. And so we're just really excited about the potential for this technology. Every day, someone new calls us up and asks us, hey, can you do this new thing with the printer? And, we'll think about it a little bit, and then we'll say, actually, no, we can. That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. We're just constantly finding these new use cases. And I guess it makes sense, right? We've got a giant 3D printer. And 3D printers are able to make most anything. So there's just a whole ton of versatility about what these machines can do. So we're really excited about the future.
Right. I came to Icon specifically for the established mission of trying to make an impact in those underserved communities. So my journey with Icon probably started way back when. So I was born into one of those communities of color in South Central LA, and kind of always in the back of my mind, one of the things I understood about the place that I was born is that that housing unit, that sense of ownership, that sense of pride, that didn't exist in the area because housing was so inaccessible to so many people based on a multitude of factors, but primarily cost. Sent me on a life's journey that had me joining the United States Marine Corps in service of people all over the world. And that philanthropic 8-year journey brought me back to the state of Texas to finish my education. even when I was going through that process, I hadn't quite found the job that was going to make that sort of meaningful impact that I was looking for. And I came across Alex and Jason when this project was still in kind of its, I'd say, middle to infancy stage, where they were just closing a round of funding and establishing the mission of like, we want to take the opportunity to use this technology to minimize human suffering and make a meaningful dent in the global housing crisis. And a light went off that this is what I need to be doing. I want to be working with a type of company that is looking for small ideas to make big impact at a global scale. And so I beat on Jason and Alex's door until they hired me, and here we are.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. I think what really struck me was just the digging down into technology on both sides, with whatever was available to you. Alex, in your case, it was what you were already working with and trying to think of a new application for it. And Kevin, really looking around at what was available and affordable, I would imagine, in the way of building materials. How do you think you came to I guess apply it on such a large scale? Because I think there are sometimes one-off ideas that people have, but clearly these are, I think you're in both cases, you're reaching bigger and bigger audiences with, or not just audiences, but users with the technology.
Yeah, Kevin, do you want to go first once again?
So Port Elizabeth is an industrial city. And I would compare it to Detroit, actually, Michigan. It kind of feels like Michigan is our sister city, with the huge motor car industry. We have a port. The motor car industry is a big driver of the economy here. And as a result, there is a lot of industrial waste, which comes in from all over the world through the motor cars, or stuff that is being built in Port Elizabeth or in South Africa that leaves South Africa through Port Elizabeth. So in a way, I think I was just fortunate to have the junkyard at my backyard, and I went there and we just pulled out stuff we could find. But there is also an element of it, which is R&D. So because I do a lot of research work on social innovation, using very low technology to work with the impoverished communities. So it had to be something that they could easily use, fix, work with. And for that reason, actually, our very structures were very much inspired by what we found in the township spaces. Township spaces are kind of like favelas stroke, how do you call it? They're not really, it's not really a slum, but it's an area where a majority of Black people of color kind of were kept during their apartheid times. And then these just grew and exploded. And in the outskirts of these areas, you find the poorest of the poorest, and they make the buildings out of a lot of industrial waste. It could be pallets, scrap metal, bits and pieces of motor car. And we kind of found our inspiration there, because the fact that they could build a room out of all that different kind of variety of material put together was already design and ingenuity. And we were learning from that. And getting them to see and accept that, because each time we went in and we would ask, is there a skill set, or is there somebody who could do something that would be, no? And it would be like, but who put that together? And there's an architect here, there's someone who's doing construction, and it's just shifting and demystifying, I guess, architecture and design. And the R&D that we've been involved in has kind of started moving architecture back to community, but acknowledging design intention within these communities. And what we did is then we worked with the various materials and kind of changed the value. And for example, if you look at the one bottle wall, that came from the fact that there is always bottles in townships, because we have a lot of what we call shabins. And the idea was, I mean, if we wanted bottles, it was one of the very easy things we could find. So we collected this and we revisited that. We introduced architecture and design to kind of think, well, what more can this material do? In the same way with pallets, in the same way with any other industrial waste that we found in the area. But over the years, because I think it's been about 10 years now, R&D has helped us now shift that material, which was seen as worthless or no value, into more architecture-like material, almost pretty close to mainstream architecture, but more on an experimental level, which is necessary so that these communities can still live off and work with it. So we find ourselves presently at a space in between mainstream architecture and what you would call social architecture, more from a, the barefoot architect. So we are in that space, but it's really what has enabled us to reach far in our communities is just, I think, the sheer scale of need is really big in South Africa. You probably know that South Africa has one of the most segregated communities in the world, and the rich are really rich and the poor are super poor. So the need is massive. And whereas government is overburdened by the need of providing, just sheer basic needs for a huge chunk of community, we see ourselves being able to fill in the space of supporting NGOs or charities, churches, any organization that is in that space that needs to go into these to help communities, but they cannot afford it. So we create some form of kind of temporary architecture using a variation of materials to hold functions for community till when services from government arrive or new housing arrives. So actually we are every I think 3 or 5 years, we are revising the architecture we built in the beginning. We either tearing it down because it's outlived its function, or we are re-strengthening it. So it's a bit of a transition thing for us. How about you guys, Alex and Dimitri?
Yeah, I can take a stab at this, Dimitri, then maybe you add some thoughts. So the question has to do with scale, right? How does ICON think about this? And I mean, the simple answer here is scale is deeply interesting to ICON. Scale allows for so many things to happen. Number one, you start transforming the lives of more than just a few people, right? The big vision for ICON is thousands and thousands of printed homes across the US and across the world. That site is just like so compelling. I think it gets me up out of bed in the morning, and I think it gets a lot of other people at ICON up out of bed in the morning. And we're starting to see that vision slowly realized with the project we're doing in Mexico, which is slated to do about 50 homes in this particular development. And we already have a row of 8 homes down there. And so when you see a row of 8 homes, it's like, wow, that's starting to be a good number. Mind can make that mental jump from 8 to 100, and then from 100, you can imagine 1,000. It's slowly starting to happen. But one of the things that we hear a lot with scale, with other forms of construction methods, is that you have to have everything be the same, right? This is what you see with manufacturing. Every iPhone has to be the same because that's the way a manufacturing line is set up. Or every prefab house has to be the same because it's on a manufacturing line. Whereas with 3D printing, each house can be totally different. And that's not just a cool thing, that is a deeply practical thing, because the needs of a community in one part of town might be very different than the needs of a community in a different part of town, right? This is not a philosophical architectural discussion. This is a deeply practical thing. Some people want 2 bedrooms, right? Some people want 3 bedrooms, right? In some parts of town, there are large families. In some parts of town, it's, single people living all by themselves. Totally different needs. And 3D printing is very well set up to provide different solutions to different sorts of people at scale. And that's really, really compelling. Customization at scale. We're super excited about that concept.
Yeah.
Dimitri, anything to add to that?
Absolutely. To piggyback a little bit off of what Kevin and Alex were saying, currently I think there's something like a 1.2 million unit disparity worldwide when it comes to the lack of housing stock. And so if you utilize the industrial model and continue to build things the exact same way that they've been built, it's clear that what you end up is a deficit in individuals without housing. And so I think the 3D printed technology presents a multitude of different interesting solutions to that problem. Alex hit on one, which was scale, the ability to have this agnostic use case to build, a single family home here and, a different type of structure, maybe a hospital or a school here to serve the needs of the community in which has that disparity. But also to kind of start thinking about a paradigm shift. If what we're doing with the industrial model has left us over 1 billion units short, even if we were to employ actively all the fantastic tradespeople, all the craftsmen, all the bricklayers, all the roofers, all the painters, and gainfully employed them, there would still be a shortage in housing stock. So we have to think critically about not only demystifying the built process, to Kevin's point, but demystifying architecture. And so utilizing this 3D printing platform to allow for people to creatively design different types of structures to serve the pieces of the puzzle that are missing from their community, whether it be schools, houses, and other meaningful structures within that space.
It's interesting you say that, because on our end, what we've done is we're using the maker concept, which actually works a lot with the 3D printers, right? And we've kind of been deploying maker spaces within areas we're working. Almost like a mobile workshop, literally, that goes from one community to another, where we have a project and for a month, we're just there building a classroom or building something of community use. Technology is definitely critical in it, because it's the one thing we move for a month, and you're there and you want to hit this thing and finish it. Because at times the distances, for example, between Port Elizabeth and Drakensberg is about 12 hours drive. So that's a truck with all the material and everything you need. And by the time you leave there, you've left a full classroom. So technology helps because the design process is actually done globally. We have a team in Detroit, Michigan, Lawrence Tech University, and we have another university in Germany. I'm in Port Elizabeth, and there's a university in Cape Town. But because of technology, we're able to model, we're able to test. Every institutional organization tests something different. And because of that, we are able to realize scale much, especially for us where it's more about community schools, clinics, community facilities. We're able to really pack the thing in a truck, and it's not really a massive truck. We're able to put them in sheets and move them to another part of the world or another part of the country and meet a need and come back and plan the next one. And even while we are already on site, the next one has been designed by a different group in India. So the technology has enabled us to connect with other parts of the world towards the same need, which is social. It's a social need. It's almost a realization that technology can eventually make us meet that mind shift or architectural shift, paradigm shift that Dimitri is referring to. We are at a point in the world where we can now all connect and move our energy towards a need of a community and realize it in a month. Previously, it would have taken what, years, get all the donors and sponsors, travel to all the various organizations, and then start putting and sticking the thing together. Now it's global by technology.
Kevin, that's absolutely right. When you start talking about the uses of digitally native design files that can accelerate that process and also really diversify the uses, you start to see some meaningful gains. And so we've been able to leverage that technology that you were speaking of to design structures for Mexico as easily as we can, single family homes here in Austin, Texas. And I don't want to steal Alex's thunder, because I know that this is definitely something that he's been working critically on for some time, but I get excited just to hear you talk about it, because I think that's the direction that this industry needs to move. That's the direction that we should be thinking about housing. How can we utilize the connectivity that we have to leverage all the knowledge that's kind of intrinsic to these different communities, which is going to help us rapidly scale up meaningful stock, but also get us thinking critically about different ways to design and build. So we're mitigating waste, and we're actually creating things that are useful and minimize suffering and get people flourishing in their spaces. And that's a really exciting opportunity that we are all on the cusp of.
I think Alex wanted to jump in on that, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to jump on. That's some great stuff. Dimitri hinted at the digital design platform that we're working on. I can't share too much information about that, but the general idea is to start to democratize architecture, right? Architecture, it's held up in this really, it's like people think that you have to engage a big fancy architecture firm to have a custom house, right? That's the mental model that people live in. But I don't think it needs to be that way, right? Architecture can be simple. It can be, most anyone can engage in this activity and do it well if they have the right tools. And a lot of people just don't have the right tools, right? The software to do this is really complicated, right? And you need a license, and that license is thousands of dollars. And so people don't engage in the design process. They say, I'm just going to leave this to someone else to figure out, and I'm going to pay them all this money. But what if we lived in a world where, you could very easily pull up a website, drag and drop a few lines, and you've got a, design for a house, right? What if it was that simple? Or what if you could just browse through a list of architectural designs the way you do on the App Store for apps, right? What if it was that simple to find a new architectural plan? 3D printing allows for us to think in that sort of way, which is very exciting.
When you say democratizing design, it's really, in my part of the world, it's really something that is urgently needed. It's powerful, simply because, as I said, the need is overwhelming, and if people wait, they wait. I remember that one project, we built a lady a workshop, and she'd been waiting for a government house for 20 years, and that 20 years can now be compressed to a month, which is really remarkable. And even more, the fact that it can be put online, as I said, someone else from a different part of the world can actually look at it, see what they like, what they don't like about it, and either improve on it or change the design according to the need. So it makes it much more accessible, especially when the tradition of old school architecture has kind of created a barrier between those who have and those who cannot afford, So what about these communities? They will never be able to afford an architect, not in the traditional sense of an architect. But technology is now taking that curtain, that veil away, and suddenly design is accessible to everybody.
Kevin, that's very well said. We fully agree with what you're saying here at ICON.
It does feel like, it gets you very excited about what's possible. And it makes me wonder, perhaps why bigger, I guess, what would you say, pure play architecture firms, mainstream, why they don't do more of this sort of thing. I understand it's also a business. What do you think some of the barriers might be? What do you guys see?
From my side, it's of course it's a business because they need to survive. A big part of it is also the size of the architectural firms. They end up becoming so big that they are railed in. It's very difficult to derail a whole architecture firm into a new way of working, and that then becomes the pitfall, so to say, because if something happens that could derail that process, it's either a threat, which means they will not accept it, or they close shop, which is happening a lot here, especially when the economy globally just spikes at one moment and then drops on the other, and you have massive retrenching occurring. Is it the same on your end in the States, by the way?
Yeah, so we've got a multitude of architectural partners, all the way from like some of those larger firms you were referring to, Kevin, all the way down to, you know, individuals that are friends of the business that, you know, run and own their small shops. And what we've seen, honestly, on our end is an inability to have access to this type of technology to even consider a different way of doing their work. So I think some of the same challenges would exist as far, okay, there is an existing business model that's intrinsic to the way that things are done. But I think more architectural firms and more individual architects would be willing to take a shot on something new if it existed. And I think just the mental shift that you have to make from like how things are today, going from that 0 to 1, like how could things be imagined in the near future, is just something that they haven't had a ton of access to. So we're hoping with a couple of the things that we're working on to kind of push that innovation, that piece of it forward, to allow for more people to design more freely, you know, more open source opportunities for them to jump into this realm, and make it accessible for more architects. And we believe that that's possible. What would you say, Alex?
Yeah, Dimitri, I think you nailed that. I mean, ultimately, ICON wants input from every part of the world and from everyone. You know, we are not picky. If you've got a good ideas for better ways to 3D print houses, we want to hear it. We want to hear it. So, you know, we engage with all sorts of parties. We've got projects in Mexico, projects here in the United States, and so, you know, we've got input from all sorts of stakeholders. We've got input from Mexico. One of the big things we like to do with the nonprofit news story that we're working with is we actually have input from the community. So they hold these community design workshops, and they ask people who are going to end up living in these houses, you know, what do you want for in your house? And that thinking, those requests get pulled into the actual design of the house. Really cool. News story can speak a lot more to that. But this is like some really creative thinking that I'm glad we are getting to incorporate into 3D printed houses.
I think maybe the other one is just the traditional architecture, because it's almost like it's gradually handed over from one generation to the other, in this case through universities, right, or through building schools, and that kind of rails it in, it keeps it that way. So it's very hard to get off. I remember the speech of was the head of department when I got into university, and it was horrifying when I heard how architects should end up being, in the sense that it was very much like, you know, architects are gods and mankind is other mortal man. You know, there's a lot of ego in it. Whereas I was just thinking, I want to be an architect so that I could just help the community develop, and suddenly you're swallowed into this whole different world. And part of it is just because of that tradition of it being handed over to another generation. You go through 5 to 7 years of architecture, and you come out of it, you know, desiring to be a superstar architect or something like that. So that has played a role. But the other is red tape. I have found in practice in Southern Africa and also in East Africa that each time you introduce a new material, there's always, if you submit it, we have a building code system. So they look at the colors. Red means concrete, blue means wood. And so they try to fit that into the existing template. And it just doesn't fit in any way, because it's not following the normal method of construction. You're looking at all these materials, and there's once we had a discussion with the fire department. So when you submit a plan, it goes through all inspectorates, and they approve it before it goes through, you know. And they just couldn't understand how we could use a recycled material for fireproofing. And we told them, but wait a minute, what about haystack buildings? They've existed for centuries. And I mean, if the fire comes, and depending on the scale, you know, there's ways of introducing fire retardants to actually ensure that you have a 60-minute check on the wall, you know. So it's just that mind shift, and you can see them seeing your point, but them trying to accept that and put it in the building regulation and codes. So that is also another area where we, just because we practicing or showing a different kind of architecture, it's almost very difficult for municipalities or usual building methods to accept it and to kind of give a regulation to approve it.
Kevin, I couldn't have said that any better. We experienced the exact same thing. Different use case, but the same thing. Just getting individuals to wrap their mind around the differences between this built technology versus what has always existed requires a certain mindset shift. Thankfully, we've had partners and in a municipality that's been willing to kind of meet us and learn through this process with us. But we've definitely gotten more than our fair share of strange looks and head scratches as people try to figure out, how does this fit into the traditional model? You're building this thing over here. How does that translate to what's already existed? And so that's definitely a challenge when you're poking the bear a little bit on the innovation front. And so we're going to need more makers like yourself, and hopefully more companies will spring up and start to challenge that paradigm in order for us to make a meaningful shift.
There's once actually we had an interesting discussion with we were building a temporary structure in a community. And they were like, well, so you put up this structure, and then a couple of years later, the actual infrastructure that's meant to be there arrives. Then we're like, no, you just lift it up, move it. And in their mind, you could just, what do you mean lift it up and move it? We're like, it's actually that easy. It's not concrete and brick. You have to demolish, you have to spend so much energy. It's actually much more easier because the whole thing is kind of, it's nuts, bolts. In our case, it's nuts, bolts, and you can reuse the material. So I think, I mean, this is the beauty of technology, right? It enables us, and especially poor communities, I mean, if, for example, in the context of Africa, we don't have to go through the whole evolution of building methods. If you could 3D print a house, imagine you're frog leaping, having to bring so much infrastructure to service and build a house. You can now suddenly build much more, which means then you are able to shift and move the needs of that society from very basic things like housing to a little bit more sophisticated things like the markets, accessing of markets, developing of economies and businesses that then strengthen and sustain the society, give them competition, they have something other than just looking at a house.
What do you think has been the role, especially I wonder, since you are looking back on your career trajectory, of universities in encouraging this kind of innovation? Because it sounds like, the mindset has to start somewhere, and the openness to unconventional building technology has to start somewhere. Dimitri, you mentioned the codes, the issue of building codes. I find that I've heard even from conventional, manufacturers that can be daunting, and it can keep a good idea sort of hidden for a long time. So how can schools, I guess, or, do they have a role in encouraging more innovation and more experimentation along those lines?
Kevin, would you like to go first, or Alex, would you like to chime in?
Maybe Alex?
Sure, yeah. A couple of thoughts. I think this is like almost a two-part question. On the university question and how do they prepare people, I started, working on the Icon project when I was in college. So in many ways, if my mind was being formed or shaped in a certain way, it wasn't such that this sort of idea was prohibitive, right? I was open to the idea. So that's pretty encouraging that the university system was not, was generally encouraging, right? In terms of the building codes and this sort of thing, the building codes are a little bit, we got to make sure that our printed houses are safe, first and foremost. That's the bottom line. I can't just come in and say, hey, trust me, guys, my walls, they're super safe. The roof's not going to fall on your head at night. That doesn't fly. So just because in the building code right now, it doesn't say 3D printed walls, and this is what it is, it doesn't mean that, we just get to press forward. What we do at Icon is we engage many structural engineers, number one. And then number two, we do a lot of testing, material tests, right? So on a very small scale, and then as well as structural tests on a slightly larger scale. And that's just on the structural side. You know, there's thermal tests that we have to do. There's waterproofing tests that we have to do to make sure water doesn't get into the house. All sorts of testing. But we are glad to do it, spend the time and energy and funds to do it, because our houses need to be safe, and they need to be comfortable, and they need to be watertight when people move in. That's like the top priority for Icon. Right? If our houses are not proper structures and they don't keep people safe and comfortable, you know, what are we doing here? Dimitri, anything to add to that?
Absolutely. And so you mentioned kind of flourishing during the university environment. And I think that's actually been tangential to our early success as an organization. So, you know, Alex is a classically trained engineer. Our CEO is an environmental biologist. So he comes to this with a different type of thinking. I'm a biologist by trade, and we've got individuals from different walks of life. You know, I think we've got a classic jazz, you know, a master's degree performer that's also our head of coding. And so I think that cross-pollination of thought has really brought a lot of ingenuity and different ways of approaching this. And I think when you talk about, you know, the university environment, that's really the best time to kind of get people thinking not only the traditional track, but how can their work or their future work, that career that they want, be impacted by other folks that are kind of in that same realm of thinking. At Icon, we've had the opportunity to give some keynote addresses to undergraduate and postgraduate students that are thinking about building science and moving into architecture. And one of the things that we've tried to encourage them to do at that university level is to spend time with ancillary, you know, trades that they're going to be working with and beside throughout their career, to start really populating those ideas of what could be different. How could this look different if I were to challenge this in some meaningful ways? And so I definitely think the onus is on the university to challenge people to think about their trade, not only in the traditional sense, because I think a solid foundation in architectural education is very important, but also to be creative in their challenging thoughts of what else could be. And I think that's definitely one way to make a meaningful impact. To the point about coding and regulation, I definitely think there's a hand-holding process that needs to take place between the cities, states, and municipalities to help give us a fighting chance at making things better than they currently are. I think if you were to poll any governor or mayor and say, are you happy with the amount of industrial waste that exists under current coding standards, I think 100% of them would tell you, like, we'd like to mitigate that in some way. And so just getting in lockstep with the partners to think critically about how to create solutions to those manageable problems. To Kevin's point, you just got to be willing to open that door. And I think it is a scary prospect for people to alter existing systems, but I also think it's incredibly plausible. And so we have to open our arms and be open to the idea of meeting the current standard while also being innovative and thinking about other ways to approach those problems to help mitigate those wasteful practices.
Universities tend to be, they are trusted institutions. They have the infrastructure and capacity to actually experiment on very large scales. What we've ended up doing is right from the changing the model of the built environment, so that from the very go, it's transdisciplinary in nature. What that does, it means, and you will not look at architecture purely from a design architecture student going into to solve a problem, but you team up an architecture student with all the other disciplines, health, education, media. And what that does is from the very beginning, like you mentioned, you have someone who's listening, your coding guy is a specialist in jazz or something. But what that does is it brings ideas. This cross-pollination is really important in trying to solve communal problems. And I say that specifically in the genre of community architecture. It might be different because architecture is, the other thing about architecture, it's very wide. It's not just mainstream architecture, commercial architecture, industrial architecture. Community architecture is actually a genre of its own that requires a different skill set. You being socially, intuitively able to pick up the challenges of a community and follow it through, and looking for, the stakeholders also differ. The role players are very different. So what we've ended up doing is, the one is just the teaching method, so that the groups that are engaging in a project are never at one go just designers. It's it's strongly backed up by other sciences. And what that does is then you have a much more holistic approach to solving a problem. And then that is kind of given back to the architecture students or the built environment to realize whatever it is that the solution could be. And that solution then ends up, for example, if you do an asset-based community mapping process, which is more a developmental approach, then you're able to actually realize that there are more resources within a community, even that stuff that nobody looks at. That's how we came across recycled material. And the skills that no one thinks that exist in a community, yet someone is building these structures. The second layer of that is actually, because of that, you're able to pull out skills from a community that would never be looked at in mainstream. And things like welding, things like beyond just bricklaying, little skills like those are then appreciated, and there's space for them to engage. And because it's a craft, it's an expertise, you're able to, through a university, actually elevate that into the next level of, these are the people who will maintain that structure when you're not there. So a lot of our work is very much built from recycled material, and we need it to be maintained, kept by these very same communities. So we end up having exchange workshops and programs with the community members so that they can sustain it. But that said, from a very low level also, from a higher level, I think it's pushing the boundaries of materials because we have several universities involved in the work that we do. For example, when we propose being made out of recycled material, laminated material, then it's verified by 3 universities, and we test different properties of it, right? From elasticity, structural strength, etc., the R value. And we are suddenly able to compress all that knowledge together and actually prove to the local municipality, oh, here are the values. This building still meets everything that you need from fire, structural strength, and it's still temporary in nature, So in a way, then it becomes one of really updating the building, in a way informing or updating the building code so that there is more spaces for 3D printed houses, temporary structures, the new kind of architecture that has not yet been put in the building code. So education, universities, the way of teaching does play a big role there.
I think that's, it's so inspiring to hear you say that, because sometimes when you're steeped in so many different projects that are going on that are big projects, or even the mainstream materials of building, especially in the Western, countries, you just feel like it's a lot. There's a lot of the same stuff, happening over and over again. And, I'm really, I know the structural, I believe that you are doing your due diligence, and making sure that your structures are all sound. But I do know it sounds like it could be a real uphill battle and expensive, depending on where you are, I would imagine. Do you, Kevin, have, you're building sometimes for the community, and I'm sure there's a way probably to work on fees if the building's going to be used, for as a community hub or whatever. But for fees for these things, here it can be, I think, an expensive process. Am I right, Alex, that when you were trying to have a material approved and?
Oh yeah, it's not a straightforward process. It's not just funds, but it's also the amount of time, right? Mm-hmm. You got to ship the samples, and you got to wait to get the samples back, and then you got to coordinate with the testing lab. It's a process. I can't imagine what it's like for Kevin.
Yeah, so fortunately, because we have a lot of R&D, a lot of our work is pushing boundaries, and we've entered into agreements. So the architecture the playing field is different in the sense that we actually have ended up getting buy-in from municipalities for us to actually, they've given us almost like a gray space where we can really concentrate on pushing those boundaries and then putting that research in reports for them to absorb and chew on and see where do they place this in the normal building codes. In South Africa, we have a department called Department of, it's a ministry in development, DST, Department of Social, Science and Technology, forgive me for that. And Department of Science and Technology is continuously trying to explore technological innovations that can push and improve lives of South Africans and Africans, you know. So there is space to do that a little bit more. And I think because we began a while ago, and this has been almost a 10-year journey, there is growing acceptance within the norm that this now needs to be something that can shift and can enable, can be accepted, that can inform mainstream architecture.
That's interesting that you said there's a gray space. Do you mean then that allows you to experiment with the temporary structure and that could lead to permanent code, written code?
Eventually, yeah, eventually. So we work on a very R&D space, research development and innovation space, and we work in South Africa, for example, with the township or informal settlements, areas that have nothing basically, and you need to put up a mobile clinic, you know, health workers cannot reach the space, you know. So we work in those kind of spaces, which can be very extreme compared to what you have in the States. So that's the kind of gray space. There is an acceptance that something needs to be done. We are doing it, actually, we do a lot of research and experimentation through the 3 universities and through other partners in different parts of the world where we explore materials, but we also explore culture, acceptance of this kind of design, because it's one thing to explore and engineer it, and then it's another thing to actually get the community to accept it, right? So you almost have to have another side of it, which is, well, what happens when the community is expecting a brick and mortar building and then you're giving them a plastic or a 3D printed house, or you know, shift also on a community level. So we test and we work on all those levels in trying to actually gain solutions that are informal.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that last piece, Kevin. I think when you're talking about global design, there's a lot of things that you need to consider from community to community. And this was something that Alex and the rest of the ICON team experienced when we were in the design workshop phase. We were incredibly cognizant of the fact that, you know, what's built in Austin, Texas is completely different than the expectation of what's built in Nacajuca, Mexico. And we didn't want to be yet another one of those tone deaf companies kind of building the thing that we were excited about that didn't serve the needs of the community that we were in. There was a really unique moment when we were in the design workshop with our partners, Echele and New Story, on the project in Mexico. And we had kind of laid out the master plan community as we saw, you know, a nice, neat grid, you know, the soccer fields are here, the school's there, the road to the market is there, and kind of laid out the houses next to one another. And we could tell that there were some looks that, oh, you know, what are these guys doing? And so afterward, kind of pulled a couple of the members from the design workshop aside and said, could you let us know, you know, where we missed the mark in this area? And they were like, yeah, you know, if you took out, you know, a cubic yard of space here and a cubic yard of space here, we could fit 4 more families on this plot of land. And it was more important to them to have a larger community utilize the space rather than having more, you know, backyard space and more green space. And so one, incredibly touching moment. And then 2, like a realization of the needs of this community is fundamentally different than the place that I hail from. And that's always something. You need that diversity of thought to make sure that what you're designing, what is being built architecturally, services the needs of that community in a meaningful way, and you're not leaving anyone out.
Well, I think that's incredible. I don't think I hear that sort of, I mean, you know, I'm sure many architects think about these things and designers think about these things, but to really articulate it and have that conversation with the end user is really great. I think this has been a great conversation. Are there any other issues that maybe we haven't touched on, Alex, that we haven't thrown out there?
That's a good question. I mean, there's so much that we talk about here. That, I mean, this conversation could go on for 3-4 hours easily. Well, I'm wondering, when's Kevin going to come to the United States and try some of his methods here?
Yeah, we definitely need a secondary conversation after this one.
Yeah.
I was thinking the other way around. When am I going to get you here so that we can have some of those 3D printed houses, really? Because I really do believe in frog leaping, using technology to frog leap, and being able to mitigate poverty. It's not necessary in our world, you know. So when I checked out what you guys are doing, and I was like, oh wow, we could actually, that's our next level. We need to get that here. So I guess that's a conversation we'll pursue, right?
Oh.
Yeah.
That's incredibly kind. And I thought the same thing when we did research. I'm like, eco bricks and upcycling them in such a way to utilize waste for meaningful structure, just kind of mind blowing. So we would love to talk to you more about this offline for sure.
I feel lucky to have witnessed this. So it's like forgive me, I don't want to tear up in front of anybody, but this was really nice. Thank you. Thank you all for taking the time today.
Absolutely. Definitely a bright spot in a tough week. So we greatly appreciate your time, Kelly and Kevin. Thank you all so very much for this.
Awesome.
High tech or low tech? It would be silly to talk about the architecture and design process today without talking about technology. And probably never more so than during this pandemic, with virtual reality, video conferencing tools, workflow management tools, even new forms of social networking for architects and designers. This past year has seen so many shifts and changes in how we practice architecture and design. So how are the leading firms shaping their technology strategies? Well, here we have representatives from SOM, Ennead, and Benevol Studios in a conversation with me last year, talking about how they're looking at the future of tech in architecture and design. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Metropolis Forum's webinar on New Tech for Architecture and Design. I'm Avi Rajagopal, the editor-in-chief of Metropolis magazine. Thank you all so much for joining us today. It's interesting that, you know, we've all gotten so used to doing this kind of, you know, norming, sharing the rules, right? Every time we plunge into a new piece of technology, we've gotten so used to this with Zoom, with Teams, or whatever other program that all of you are using to get your work done day in and day out. At the very start of this, you know, work from home period that we're going through right now, Metropolis reached out to a few architects and designers. Among them was a construction manager, and you know, he was complaining that he didn't even have space on at his home to roll out the drawings that he usually works with. So, you know, as we're talking about technology today for architecture and design, I think it's just a reminder that, you know, there are many processes in the architecture and design practice that still rely on, you know, tangible physical tools. There are many ways in which our ways of thinking are still tied to the tools that we're used to, and working with new tools is a process of adaptation. So, you know, there's video conferencing software, of course, as that we're all using today, workflow management tools, BIM plugins, you know, of all kinds of VR, AR, all kinds of new technologies that are coming into architecture and design practice. And certainly some of that adoption seems to be set to accelerate thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic. So how are architecture and design firms adapting their technology strategies, and what do they have their eye on for the future? To help us answer, We are very, very thrilled to have with us three amazing speakers, all great thinkers and practitioners, especially at the intersection of technology and architecture and design practice. Rob DeMillo, who is Chief Technology Officer at SOM. Thanks so much for joining us, Rob.
Thanks for having me.
Don Weinreich, who is a partner at Ennead Architects. Hi, Don. Thank you
Hi,
for
nice to
joining
see you
us.
again.
And Michael Beneville, who's the founder and CEO of Beneville Studios and also the Chief Creative Officer at Area 15. And we'll talk about Area 15 in just a little bit. Hi, Michael.
Pleasure to be with all of you.
So, Rob, I'd like to kick it off with you. You came to SOM a few months ago, but before that, you worked on space exploration, on weather systems, on entertainment, media, and also you were very engaged with cloud-based platforms, most recently in the animation industry, which seems very apt for this time. We're all using some kind of cloud-based software at this point to keep work going with our colleagues. How are you bringing that expertise to SOM, and why do you think it's important for the firm, but also for architects and designers?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I've been at SOM now for a little over a year. I came here, as you pointed out, from the animation industry, and my career's been an interesting rocket ship ride. So I started out in space flight and later with the FAA, and then moved from there to entrepreneurial work. But the entrepreneurial work was always around large scale issues and projects. So heavy mathematics, a lot of load on the systems, a lot of heavy computer graphics. So I stayed with that theme for many, many decades and followed it as we went from sort of large mainframes to smaller workstations to PCs to phones and tablets, and then back up the chain again to the point where we're now utilizing cloud service technologies that you couldn't have imagined years ago. And what was striking to me was when I was at Nimble Collective, which was the animation company I was at prior to coming to SOM, was the problem set was very similar. It was the same sort of mindset with the people that were using the animation software, very talented people, very artistic and design oriented, but also heavy into math and heavy into manipulation of heavyweight objects on screen. We founded that company with the idea of taking that idea of a studio where you had several hundred people working on an animated film and getting rid of the equipment and moving the whole thing into the cloud. We were successful in doing that. During that exploration, I got very, very interested in the AEC community and architecture in general, and coming to SOM was just a natural thing to do.
That's really interesting. In architecture firms, we know it takes a village to get a project done. And there's so many parallels to the animation industry. So many hands touch a single project, and you're dealing with high fidelity, high quality information and data that needs to be transferred seamlessly from hand to hand. And that's very true of architecture as well. So I think it's really interesting how we might look at a future where architecture firms can do the same thing, right? Move a lot of their technology infrastructure to the cloud and be able to rely on that. Don, I'd love to bring you in here. That kind of, transformation in practice, right? Going to cloud computing. I mean, I remember, when BIM had such a, big sort of adoption curve, let's say, within the architecture and design field, and Ennead actually was at the forefront of that. You've seen many technology shifts in architecture practice. How do you see processes at Ennead changing today, and what role does technology play in that?
Sure. That's a great question, and one probably with no answer, but let's at least explore it a little bit. I mean, I'm in thinking about today's topic, there are really three basic areas that I think are interesting to explore. One is the impact of the current situation that we're all in on community and culture. I'm talking about the community and culture of a professional practice. In our case, we have about 220 people, some in New York, some in Shanghai, and how is our culture affected? another one which has a bit to do with cloud, but is one that's very much on my mind, is this challenge of data sprawl. I'll come back to in a minute. And then I think that the last one, and perhaps the most challenging, is what will this autumn look like when we start returning to our offices in phase, or maybe it happens this summer, or wherever our audience is. It may happen sooner or later, depending. But just to kind of pick away at each of those for a moment, the impact of work from home, kind of extended and mandated work from home on the culture, has been, I wouldn't say it's a presumption, but one can assume that everyone is available all the time. Whenever you need someone, you hit a button and there they are. Now, that might not be the most appropriate time to contact someone. So this has been strangely disruptive to the work-life balance, even though staff are all at home, but their lives have been disrupted. So we actually built a tool to help with that, to kind of stimulate the experience of being in the office to some degree. So every day we all check in online, and you do it, there's a web interface. You check in, you identify yourself, are you working today or not? You can leave a little message for people, and the dot that represents your seat in the office changes color to say, okay, I'm in. And there's this kind of wonderful experience that I have every morning when I go to work early. So at 7:30 or 8, and I can see that the office kind of light up with people. And that to me is a signal when it's okay to contact somebody. So there's both the spatial memory of where we all work, our work home, and then this kind of sense of, this passive sense of awareness of your colleagues that you also get in an office. So that's been very good. Managing workflow has also been a really big challenge. You can't just lean over to somebody and say, okay, ready to give this to you. So we've built some virtual workflow monitoring tools so that people can have an awareness of when something is ready for them to receive, and they can signal to others that it's ready for a handoff. And it can be bi-directional, because we don't really work in a linear way. I think, as far as looking forward, the big challenge, I think, is going to be, right now, we can all have this rather intimate experience, albeit virtually. We can collaborate. I can get closer to 6 feet from any of you, and we could share a document or look at a drawing together. But if we're in the office but have to stay socially distant, how can we really collaborate where proximity of less than 6 feet is kind of important? And what will it be like when some people are out of the office and some people are in the office? Will there be 50 simultaneous web meetings going on all the time with a lot of crosstalk and chatter driving each other crazy? And the data sprawl thing also, I think that a lot of these platforms really enable and encourage a very rapid transfer and sharing of information. But where is your data? Are you meeting all the compliance rules for safeguarding it? It is really essential. And then the last thing I'll just mention, which is interesting about these communication platforms, which actually are quite good, but they lack something that a telephone has, which is duplex audio. So we've all been in those situations where there's that kind of awkward pause. 2 people start speaking at once, and then they both stop, and no one quite knows who to go next. So duplex audio would be a great enhancement.
Thanks so much for that, Tom. That's like such a great wide sweep across different technologies. There's lots of pieces in there that I'd love to return to, or that I'm sure the audience is going to kind of pick up with you. Just a couple of points to emphasize. The one is, I think it's really interesting talking about, finding that technology fit that works for your office culture. I love that idea of the web interface that tells you when people are in the office. My own team does that by, saying hi and good morning every time they sign on in the morning, but we're a small enough team that works. And I think it just indicates that people are available, and it prevents that leach into their personal lives. But also, this kind of norming or rule forming around, workflow, right? moving files from one person to the other, trying to replicate that. And I can't tell you how many times I've been in Zoom calls where coworkers have said, let's keep doing calls like this, even if we're all back in the office, right? There's something we find quite charming about, being able to share a screen and live in virtual space together, because so much of our work happens in the virtual sphere anyway. Before we move on to Michael, again, I just want to remind everyone, thanks so much for joining us today. We're here talking about new technology in architecture and design with Michael Beneville of Beneville Studios, Don Weinreich of Ennead Architects, and Rob DeMillo of SOM. Michael, I'd love to bring you in here. Don talked about this really amazing thing that they've done, very sweet, of being respectful to each other in the office, seeing when everybody's in the office and so on. You had gone one step further even before this COVID-19 crisis hit. Your office, Beneville Studios, was working on a full digital twin of your office, a sort of VR replica of your office, even before the crisis hit. Why were you doing that? Also, it seems to me that, with Area 15, which is this 250,000 square foot event space in Vegas that you're working on, you're looking at, a digital twin or at least a twinned digital experience to that physical space as well. Tell us about both of those projects, creating the VR experience of your office as well as Area 15, and how that has developed in recent weeks.
Well, at the risk of being or sounding too sci-fi, and I think 6 or 7 weeks ago, a lot of this stuff sounded like gobbledygook to most of the world, and there's been a huge accelerator and adoption of this virtual world. And we're in a virtual world right now, even in a Zoom. There's so many levels of worlds. I think that it stems from my interest in the fact that I fundamentally believe that humanity not will, but already has opened up a fissure into a parallel dimension. And we are uploading, every single thing that we that we hold dear into it. And a lot of it's junk, but a lot of it is actually meaningful. My interest in all of this really stems from, I think, probably my work over the last few decades. I have a studio in New York City that services clients around the world, but primarily in the US. And we call ourselves an idea manifestation machine. So an idea manifestation machine is a machine. It's a small team of ninjas that take an idea, come up with an idea, run with an idea, do all of these things. But we don't just sort of think it out and leave people with a list of here's some good things to think about. We often execute the project as well. So if it's within the skill set of the team or it can be done at that scale, we'll do that in-house. But more often than not, we are engaged and plugged into teams of thousands. I am not an architect. I'm not officially a designer. I don't really know what I am. I'm an artist of some sort or another that runs an idea manifestation machine. That's what I do. And so we come into contact with all of the architects and all the trades and all these different people that are, part of what we do. So we're agnostic to medium also, meaning that at any given point in time, we're creating a book, we're making a machine, some sort of clock that tells the story of a family's life or something like that. And then on beyond that, we're creating something like Area 15, which is this complex in Las Vegas, or we're the chief creative consultants for iHeartMedia. So we just design their headquarters, but we also oversee 5 million square feet of their real estate as they convert it into the 21st century. And we do that with incredible architecture firms, A+I being one of them. So to answer your question, it actually goes back to an iHeart revelation I had 7 or 8 years ago when we were designing the headquarters for Bob Pittman and for what was at the time Clear Channel is now iHeart. We were designing the whole place in SketchUp with A+I. And it occurred to me that it really just felt an awful like a video game. And I realized that we had actually built the project before ever having swung a hammer. And it made me feel at the time, and I remember expressing it to Pittman and others at the time, just, you realize that we have a vast office here. we're not limited to the 75,000 square feet of this place. We have millions of square feet, and all we need to do is to generate more and more from the model. The project's already done. And so that was where it sort of tweaked. And then I started to feel very much that that in our work, some of the tools that we use are ancient. They haven't fundamentally changed in 1,000 years, and some of the things are brand new. The VR piece of it became something where we thought we must understand how VR impacts us as a medium and how we're going to convert the files and the data and all of these stories into something that is compelling for the next generation. I don't believe, I'll kind of close on this, that any technology replaces another one completely. In fact, they all just sort of fall into the quiver of arrows of what you need for the use case. So I imagine that in the next 2 to 10 years or whatever, the glasses won't just be one thing or another. They will allow me to see reality this way, see reality this way, augment my reality, FaceTime my reality or whatever. And if I want to go deeper, blank out my reality and plunge into a VR reality. And I'll toggle between those same things the way that I do through the telephone and the FaceTime today, and when I want to go deeper. So we fell into that world and got, a good friend of mine is a guy named Philip Rosedale who invented Life, which is an incredible online world. Mm-hmm. He was working on a virtual reality version of that called High Fidelity. He has pivoted into something which, Don, I think you'll really appreciate if you haven't been in there yet, but it is full duplex audio. It's 100 people clapping their hands and nothing is lost. So I'm an advisor to that project, to High Fidelity, and then with a group called Tivoli, we built this virtual version of the studio. And the last thing I'll say is that I believe that when you create a world that is a facsimile of a real world that you've been in, your connection to it is deeper. It's more palpable. I walk through this space and I have memories. And I don't have memories of this virtual space. I have memories of the physical space that I've acquired over the last 7 or 8 years of being in that physical space. And during this COVID, I've been on the West Coast. But to be able to walk through my studio, see my team, see my dog, Oliver, in the corner, and be able to invite clients in and to have a boundless world of screens, it's still, unfortunately, the world of VR is still an ivory tower. We have to break down the barriers of that and put headsets into people's hands. But yeah, that's why I did it.
Again, there's lots of themes in there, I think, that connect with what all three of you had said. We're here talking about new technology in architecture and design with Rob DeMillo from SOM, Don Weinreich from Ennead Architects, and Michael Beneville of Beneville Studios. And I think one of the themes that's emerged here is really, the connections between the physical work process and physical expression, physical memory, and technology that's for the most part digital. Whether it's looking at having a lot of our work product going to the cloud, whether it's about replacing face-to-face interaction with video conferencing type interaction, whether it's taking our memories of physical space into a VR model. And our first question here from the audience actually kind of connects to that. One of our attendees is asking, I'm curious about Don's comment about duplex audio, which Michael just referenced as well, and the stop-start pattern of most current communication conference call technologies. It's difficult to replicate the collaboration of a shared physical conference room. Do you see other technologies on the horizon that will help rectify that? Don, I'll let you come in on that, but I would just like to expand that to, sort of those little moments of, entropy, like loss of quality that we still experience when we go into, a digital workspace or life space, and what are some of those sort of slippages and how do we address them? But Don, I'll let you come in on the duplex audio thing.
Yeah, I don't have any specific answers. I think Michael is probably the right person to talk about that. But what Michael was saying actually made two words kind of stick in my mind. This notion of fidelity. which if you think of the definition of the word, it's about truthfulness, but it's also about richness and kind of complexity. So having high fidelity interactions with people is definitely a challenge in the current circumstance. A lot of fidelity is lost. Like, I can't tell if Rob's foot is tapping because he's getting bored listening to me. If I was in the room with him, I might notice that and adjust. The issue of memory is also a really interesting one. And then there's this other category of people right now. I don't remember exactly how many. I think there might be 5 people who have joined AnyAd after we all left the office. So they have no memory. Their only knowledge of it is this weird circumstance. And what will it be like for them to meet us one day at home? So if we have, I guess our check-in app is a very crude version of Michael's virtual office. You know, it gives you something to latch onto that has a kind of physicality. But other ways of improving the fidelity and interaction, I think we're still using the tools that we have sort of crudely, and they're a bit disjunctive. Like even right now, we can talk, we can see each other, we have some notion of what the audience might be thinking because they're engaging with us. We're actually starting to use surveys of our staff to understand their state of mind, their situations, which will help us plan, you know, how to improve the office generally and how to plan for the return to work. So I'm not sure I answered the question, but that's what I was thinking.
Oops.
No, please.
Yeah, there's a number of startups that are working on the fidelity problem for audio. I mean, getting full duplex over VoIP is a difficult thing to do, as you all know, because it's not a broadcast mechanism. It's sort of everyone gets a packet at a different point in time. But there are a lot of people that are trying to tackle the problem. For me, the issue seems to be more of an uncanny valley. There's something wrong with this, right? And you can't quite put your finger on it, but the interaction with other people is just slightly off. And I think a lot of it causes video conferencing fatigue, just because you're repetitively going from environment to environment to environment. But you do adapt to it. Michael, when you don the VR helmet, you have to adapt to that, right? I mean, you're in a world that's very de-resed compared to what you're experiencing in the real world, and it's off-putting for 20-30 minutes, but then your brain adapts to it and you kind of move forward from there. Something very similar, I think, is happening in this this world we've entered into. Before the COVID crisis, I was my team was working on consolidating all of our software that we were using for doing collaborative efforts, and so it was just kind of coincidental that it hit at the point in time that it did. But we've gone down to video conferencing and Slack, and you know, I see questions in the chat about whiteboard applications. We're experimenting with those as well. But so just kind of bringing people into these single points of contact for different type of communications channels is helping. But yeah, Don's point, there's something quite off about communicating.
I think, Rob, if I may, I totally agree with you. And that uncanny valley is absolutely that's the holy grail right now, is how to crack the code on it. I also, you know, I think we all believe that being in person is absolutely a critical way of bonding and forming a team, if it's possible. I know that it will not be possible for my studio to continue to do its work if I am virtual the entire time. We have a shorthand, and we're able to communicate in this environment and to be so effective because we've had 15 years of working together, and we know each other's social cues, and we know each other's, we can sense these tiny little things. I also believe that the nuance of sound and spatial audio and spatialness is very important. And that's actually a limitation, you know, oh gods of Zoom, I know you're listening, but it's a limitation to what we're experiencing right now, which is that we don't have a sense of the room or where everybody is in it, or hearing sound in our different ears. And it's not possible to break into the conversation or chat with the person next to us without bothering the the conference or the speakers and things like that, which is one of the things that has fascinated me about the rich landscapes of VR, and then also the high fidelity. Don, I think you'll be fascinated, and it's free right now. You just go to highfidelity.com, spin up a server, and suddenly you are in a space where you might just be a dot, but you're a dot with 10 or 15, or we've had up to 100, 200 people in there at any given point in time. And where you are is where you are as a dot. But you can hear the sound, and you can move, and you can go to different areas and places. And because you can drop a floor plan in underneath it, you're really walking through an office. And it starts to mimic something really interesting. When we've set maps that are familiar to us, the whole group understands what to do. And you can break into a conversation that's happening, and it's really interesting that you literally turn your little avatar towards it and back and forth. We're social creatures, and we need to be in person. You were asking, Avi, about Area 15. The reason that I think that it's such an interesting project and why we created it is I fundamentally believe that people want to be together physically and digitally at the very same time. And we're already seeing the hack together versions of that, because we're walking around with our phones and texting each other while we're in the same, we've all had the experience of not getting up to go to the next room and just texting somebody who's literally 100 feet away, because we want to be face and also digitally connected. So this is not to replace anything. It's to add this extra layer of hopefully flexibility and ease, and maybe some sort of environmental impact of us traveling a little less.
The issue of asynchronicity is really, it's still not been overcome. So if you ever want to try an interesting experiment during a Zoom call, try closing your eyes and just listening to people speak, and suddenly much easier to understand them because they're not out of sync with their video. It's true.
As you heighten the senses.
We all had that eerie experience of driving in a car while talking on a cell phone, hands-free, of course, and just finding it to be a very, very unsettling experience. Like your mind really struggles to be in two places at once and to kind of patch these things together when information isn't synced.
So what's interesting to me is I'm here. I'll confess in front of all these people. I'm a gamer, and so several times a week, or a couple times a week at least, I'll hop on a multiplayer game, and it's immersive. You're on with 20, 30 other people, several hundred other people in some cases. You very quickly adapt. Right. And I have friends that I play with all the time. They're on the same teams and squads that I'm on. And you get very used to sort of turning to face the avatar, as Michael said. And the barrier kind of goes away. And I bring it up for a reason, because what's interesting about it is I don't have that sense of something's not quite right. That I do with the Zoom meeting. And I think that has to do with the fact that your brain has accepted the fact that this world's not real.
Yes.
Your friend's not a wizard. you're not running around with a glowing sword, right? It's like, so you've already accepted and jumped over that chasm.
Yeah, there are also more complex things going on in a Zoom meeting.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's been erased from the fidelity is you can't see the micro gestures in a person's face. They're so indicative and so much a part of communication.
Right.
Yeah, and as the latest VR goggles come online, I think the Vives have eye tracking. So it's really interesting when I'm speaking with an avatar who has an eye tracking headset, because there's just that extra layer. And in fact, in my VR world, which Tivoli spun out of the first high fidelity that Philip Rosedale built, in that world, I had a Doob scan of myself. So I went to Doob. Michael Anderson got me scanned. It took a minute. A week later, I had an avatar of myself, which was a marionette. But I'm wearing my father's, blazer from 1980, and I look like me, pretty much. So I think it's a really fascinating thing to, when you invite somebody in and you look the way that you do, and of course I could add wings and all of that, but essentially I look like me on any given day. We're starting to blend these worlds, and what an exciting time to be studying and be entering the workforce, and to enter into a world that Don and Rob and I have been in already. My hair's a little gray here, I can't imagine how exciting it is to be 20 or 30 years old and thinking, my God, like these worlds are opening up, and they really are. And we are experiencing right now the crappiest picture on the tiniest little television with the most, inane programming. We haven't even worked out what to put on these devices yet. Gaming was an easy thing for conversion, and VR certainly has been very fortunate that gaming is such a logical transfer into it, but it hasn't replaced keyboard gaming. VR hasn't yet done that. At some point it will, but it won't replace it. It's just going to be, there's the general with the keyboard, and there's the first-person shooter in the field, or whatever it is. But it's an extraordinary time, and I think it's an extraordinary time. Back to your point, Rob, because when we were kids, and I love this about my childhood, and I read a book, I imagined a book. We all read a book and we all imagine the book. When you play a game with a lot of people and you're sharing a world, you're actually sharing it can change, but it's a canonized world. It's something that 10 years after you've played that game, you could meet somebody who also played that game and describe a particular tunnel and a thing that was down at the end of it and all of that. So an entire generation of gamers is entering the workforce and is going to create the next universe, both physically, architecturally, and I already feel the impact of gaming on architecture. I think it raises the stakes of what reality needs and wants to look like, and how fanciful it could be, and how embracing it can be. It's always been that way, but there's two kinds of ways of reacting to virtual and digital worlds in the physical architectural world. It is to build things that are so gray that they disappear, and they are really a backdrop for whatever digital content and experience you want to put on them, or to build something that's so fanciful that when you take off your whatever it is that you're taking off, you're in a world of wonder. And it's the intersection of those two things, how we move from one state to the other, that's absolutely, for me, one of the most interesting things. How do we transition from multiple realities and not be shocked by them, and not feel uncanny valleys?
Right. And I would like to suggest that, actually that uncanny valley, the uncanny valley of a printed book is very large. It's a huge chasm, right? So there's lots to imagine. And I think the question is, what are those spots of imagination, when you're in a digital environment? And, that what we've been describing as a loss of fidelity is also, in a sense, an opening for people to supply imagination, and to supply, a vision in there. And so I think that transition is going to be interesting. I'm going to let you come in, Rob, in just a second. But I just want to remind everyone, we're here talking about new technology in architecture and design. We're having a fantastic discussion, I think, about the relationship between reality and virtuality, right? And what that means for architecture. We are about 20 minutes to the close of this program, and we have quite a few questions from our attendees lined up here. I'd like to take one that seems related to what we were just talking about with Michael. Tim Cozens asks, relating to new graduates entering the A&D professions, what tech skills beyond BIM do you look for as perhaps minimum? What is ideal? So, what are the attitudes to technology that, that those 20 and 30-year-olds that we need them to have coming into the architecture profession? That seems a good question to take. We'll take that one across the panel really quick, and then I think we'll start taking the questions in at a little bit more rapid clip after that.
Sure. Would you like me to go first?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
Don, please.
So, I mean, BIM is both a set of practical skills and I think also creative skills. And the people who are really good with it have taken a craft and elevated it to an art. And they are very rare and incredibly valuable because they're thinking in a kind of digital modality all the time. But in terms of tech skills in general, mostly what excites us when we're interviewing people is not so much the knowledge of a specific platform, but cross-linking the uses of platforms and getting exciting results out of those and being able always to think, how can I use this tool and apply it to a problem, as opposed to let me celebrate this tool and use it for its own sake. And that's when, again, the craftsperson becomes the virtuoso, because they're just doing these amazing things all the time because there's something else going on there, and the technology is just the tool. And we've actually we've just rolled out a new role in our office on all of our project teams. There will be someone whose job it is to be devoted to and focused on the intersection between computation and whatever it is that project team is doing. And it's as broad a mandate as that. And if they leave out older generations or younger generations, then they're missing the point.
I'll pile onto that. I mean, I come from the software world, software engineering and software architecture, different kind of architecture. And the successes that I've seen in my career when you apply software engineering to other verticals, and this applies to architecture as well, is the ability to abstract. So you don't focus on a tool, you don't focus on a specific product or a product line, you focus on the methodology and what's happening behind the pixels. And coming into the field with an understanding of, okay, so I'm driving a Mustang and I understand, like, how to change the oil filters and how to do, like, if you've got some basic idea of what's happening when you turn the ignition and start steering the car, it's going to help you in a new car, right? And your task is to get your job done. Your engineers and your designers and your stylists and your architects. And what you want to do is abstract your knowledge to your profession and point in those areas. And the tools behind the scenes should just become these opaque things to you.
I just couldn't agree more. I mean, honestly, artists have always been inventors of different kinds of technology. They solved as they needed to solve. But technology stripped of meaning or mission is not really at the essence of what any of us are trying to achieve. And it is when you find the true meaning and raison d'etre for something that it starts to, your body starts to tingle and transform. And that's what I think is so exciting about these times. We haven't yet invented, and nor do we know how any of these things will impact us. The best we can do is to ground ourselves in some understanding of what the past implications have been, and just hope that we're all doing a good enough job to consider what the future implications will be, and along the way, hopefully make the world, a little bit better and be more beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, I think these responses, even though they're in response to a question about sort of, emerging professionals and what skills they need to build, they're all skills that, I mean, that's an attitude we all have to build.
I'd say I'd love to say a lot, because I think it's such a wonderful question for a person who's entering now. How do you prepare? How do you prepare for a world that transforms every 2 years? It's absolutely impossible. You're going to enter school and the world will have changed 3 times by the time that you're out of it, which we all know. That's just true. And I think the best, for me, the best way to prepare for that is sort of, Yuval Harari's point of view that anybody who tells you what the future is a liar, but anybody who tells you that it doesn't look like science fiction is a liar. Unless we blow ourselves up, and we could, the world is going to look like something that we cannot possibly imagine. And I'm not, I'm not in 50, 60 years, but in 20 or 30. And so to prepare for that is to, in my opinion, it is to study the fundamentals more than the particulars. It is to understand the arcs of narrative storylines. It's to understand, mythology and how characters act and behave, and look to the past, but don't be bounded or bound by it or chained by the past. But it's the only way I know of preparing for the future is to look to the past and to try to recognize not the circle, but the spiral of us repeating and repeating and repeating with just greater and greater technological prowess. So that's a big, wide, philosophically open thing, but I honestly feel it's the truth. Don't think that what you're learning is,
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and if we're looking at mythology to look at character, we certainly should be looking at architectural history to look at space. We're going to take a few questions now at a fairly rapid clip. So I'll have the panelists kind of respond one by one. Lightning round, exactly. Whiteboard software. Anybody would like to take that up? How do we, maybe Rob, this is one for you.
Yeah, we're
how
looking
can smaller teams collaborate?
We're looking at all this now. We've been sort of ad hocing whiteboard software to date, and now we have teams internally that are looking at things like Miro and Concept Board, and we're giving them to our internal studios to see how they operate in those environments. And natural selection, there'll be a winner at the top, and that's one we'll invest in. But architects at SOM and architects in general, they're very tactile. So seeing things pinned up on the walls and having studio sessions around those pinups and physically talking about it, that you want to take from either Don or Michael, I forgot who said this, but you don't want to replace those things. You want to augment those things, right? So the ability to do that when you return back to the office, and in addition to that, have a digital way to do it. So you could have, a monitor up on the wall that is next to the pinups that you could use to interact with, which would also help with social distancing done, which was part of the conversation we had earlier. But yeah, so we're looking at all those. I don't have a definitive answer for you yet, but give it a week.
Yeah. Yeah. Don, you mentioned a workflow monitoring tool.
Sure.
Eric Sanas. Is it similar to a Gantt chart that shows how a team is working, making progress? Yeah. What is the tool you're using?
Yeah, actually, it's not a Gantt chart. It was really, it came about out of necessity. We were preparing a proposal that was going to be about 350 pages long, and I think 6 different people were all authoring content for it. There was a complex editorial chain, and everything had to parallel process. So it was becoming impossible to understand the state of any of this. So all we did was create a very simple, it was just with Excel, which is still one of my favorite tools because it's actually tabula rasa and using conditional formatting and a series of things.
Oh, Don.
It's the best.
Yeah, we could actually make it graphically compelling, so it was fun to watch. So when you finished your task, you click the box, your box changed color, and the person who was the next in the handoff chain, their box lit up. So you could always okay, I'm watching out for, green boxes today. And then if I went backwards, I would uncheck it. So it's very easy to do that. And what was cool about it, I would really encourage everyone, to believe in rapidly self-organizing solutions, because a Gantt chart it's a very particular kind of a tool, and I don't think it evolves very well in a natural context where everything is sort of a swirl of activity. When you've got a network of influences all pushing on it, it's much more linear kind of a thing. So allowing that experimentation and build the tool on the fly and rebuild it on the fly was very successful. And the other thing we did with it, which made it work, was we hosted it in a SharePoint environment where everybody could see it in real time. So it was all about dashboarding, and in general, that's probably the topic for a whole other webinar, just to talk about dashboarding and instrumentation of practice.
Yeah. But I was just thinking as you were talking, as with many types of architecture, loose fit sometimes is the best fit. You want that space for growth and for experimentation. Kathleen has a question for you, Michael. She's curious about how do we break down some social inequities when we're designing mixed reality spaces, especially in education. She works as a design educator and a consultant in K through 12 education and STEAM and project-based learning. And so how do we bring people in an equal footing?
I'm so glad you asked this question, because I can give you a real world example of a company which made a major pivot because of this particular question. So thank you so much for it. And I go back to high fidelity. Philip, who was the creator of Second Life, which is still a vast online world and has hundreds of thousands of people in it. For the last 3 or 4 years, after he sold that, and in the last 3 or 4 years, he started to build a virtual reality version of it, basically assembled the whole team and built something extraordinary. I look like me in there. We are all hanging out. It's 500 people at a party. Thomas Dolby's playing on stage. It's great. But what the reality is that, and I asked him this, and we were hanging out in San Francisco one day. I said, why are you pivoting? And he said, because I will tell you how many people are in VR right now in the world. And we pulled it up on the screen and we saw an active number. And I think on that day, on a Wednesday in San Francisco, worldwide, there were about 5,700 people in VR. Not in many headsets, not headsets, but in VR. And he said, the problem with this is that it hasn't, with VR so far, is that it's an ivory tower. It costs at least $2,500 up until recently to have a PC that's powerful enough to really play, to be in one of those social environments with deep connection and deep, all of these things. And so remarkably, and in answer to your question, he did not abandon the project, but really pivoted and said, we're going to start from the other end, not who can get in because of the technology they have, but let's build a platform that anybody using a cell phone, a tablet, or a computer who has access to the internet and just can get to a URL is going to have high fidelity, high quality, 3-dimensional audio and a positional way of being able to move themselves around a map and interact with other people. And then we'll layer on top of that all of the other goodies and all of the other things, so long as it never forces out that baseline. And that's where the project is right now. And it's only a couple of months old. It's in a beta, but it is an answer to precisely that: is how can you build a world that the whole world can get into? And above and beyond that, how can you do it in a way that, Rob, you understand video games. How can you do it in a way that doesn't shard everybody into 100-person groups, but actually creates one big world? A world where when 300,000 people or 1 million people are watching a concert, they could walk over to anybody there and meet and speak with them. Yeah. So those are exactly, it's a wonderful question, because the entire future of our of the industry, all of it depends on that. It's no good if only 100,000 people can get in. Millions and billions of people need to be able to get in and interact and exchange. That's the goal.
Yeah. This is like such a fantastic conversation. We are here talking about new technology in architecture and design. Quick next question. Don, this might be one for you. What technologies can manufacturers look to incorporate in support of architects and design? What tech platforms should manufacturers use to communicate sample and support specifications, especially when vendor relations are going to change, obviously, because of people being allowed access into offices and so on. So, how do we work with vendors in the new norm?
I think maybe the best answer is just to describe some of the challenges and pain points we're experiencing right now. And I don't know what the industry will produce. So let's say activities surrounding project management, just a basic communication, are reasonably well handled under the current circumstance. You begin to get into more challenges around collaborative sketching, and we couldn't really pass around a physical model to each other and share it, but I could show you a drawing. So when you start to deal with things that really only exist at high fidelity in reality, that becomes a challenge. So for our teams who are involved in construction administration activities are probably having the biggest challenges right now, because it's hard to get to a construction site. They may not even be permitted on a construction site. And that's a fundamental piece of their work. So how can technology build a bridge that will produce enough fidelity so they can observe construction, be of assistance to contractors and so forth? I think that's kind of a big one. I think another challenge, and I mentioned it earlier, is when everyone is working from home, that's a pretty consistent envelope that we're all in. But when some of us are working from home and some of us are in the office, how do we complete that into a single integrated team? That's another kind of.
And those will be there will be a time where your position is mapped both physically in a place and also virtually in a place, and it will correspond and blend both of these worlds. And there's ways of hacking that together right now, but it will become, I think, more and more of an important thing. Where you're having, I mean, it sounds kind of crazy, but it's true. You'll be having a conversation with a sort of ethereal ghost version of a person peripherally who's also walking the site with you.
I think it's also dramatically changed the way offices are designed, but because the social distancing thing will overcome when the infection or when the risk of infection is lower. But there's nothing more maddening than hearing half of a conversation.
Right.
Yeah.
Where you hear somebody talking on a cell phone on a bus, and you're kind of going out of your mind. Imagine sitting in an office where the person to your left and the person to your right are having these things.
Michael, in the space industry, we called that remote presence.
Remote presence,
and that was the idea. It was that you were not on the surface of Mars, right? But you have an avatar in the form of a robotic entity that is you, right? So.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. I think it's interesting how some of these things will play out, though. Between people who are not from the same sort of work community. So, when we're talking with clients or vendors versus people who are part of the same community, like, coworkers in an office, right? So I think some of those things around, especially questions around security, which, for vendors, that's especially important, right? So they can't enter offices right now because not even when offices permit their own employees to gather together in their physical workspace, they're likely going to limit the ability for outsiders to enter into that space, right? That will be a second step in the return. So I think as we anticipate that, the questions are similar to the questions that are going to come when we do have that remote presence, right? So what is the security impact in terms of somebody versus somebody who is further removed in your network? I'm gonna take just a couple more questions here. We have someone asking, I think this is for you, Michael, if they can get a tour of your virtual office. I'm not sure a tour is possible, but maybe Metropolis can help with previews.
Yeah, but if they have a headset and want to get in touch, I'll make the time, of course.
Heather McDonald, and this might be a question for you, Don. How can nature and wellness work in and around VR? So, currently the architecture world, we're so concerned around health, sustainability, things like that. And we're having a conversation about technology, and we can't, keep those things separate, right? They don't live in separate boxes.
Yeah. Well, I think the benefits of a biophilic experience are well established now and no longer under debate. I think VR with sufficient fidelity could probably provide some benefit there, but there are other people here today who are more expert in that. The issue of wellness, and I think also the issue of just health in general, the survey that we're about to launch for our staff is going to be very much intended to help us understand how to improve wellness. And in all of my conversations right now with my clients, what should we be thinking about doing when we go back? And some of the measures that they ask about, I think, are perhaps overshooting the mark, all with the very best of intentions. because you can't really design a great solution for the current circumstance, because if you're in a big city, even if you have a nice sanitary office, how is anybody supposed to get to work? You know, the risks, the external risks are much greater. So I'm encouraging people to take kind of a balanced approach and think about, you know, things as simple as improved filtration systems and touchless everything, things that will have a long-term benefit just in an ordinary cold and flu season.
Yeah.
I think too, Don, you know, it's, I'm somebody who really loves a phone call because I can pace and I can move and I can, you know, tend the plants or do whatever it is that I'm doing. And I think limiting the amount of time that we actually need to see each other by making the times in which we do more rich is a path to wellness also. Just being mobile, it's hard to sit in front of the screen all day on calls, and it starts for me at around 6 a.m. and it goes all day.
Sure.
Right. I urge everyone also in the audience to think about, you know, neurodiversity as an aspect of wellness. You know, we're in our June issue in Metropolis, we're actually highlighting neurodiversity as one of many concepts that we think the workplace needs to really take seriously post-COVID. And, you know, virtual experiences, technological experiences can be hugely liberating for people who think in certain ways or work in certain ways. We know that, you know, through studies with people on the autism spectrum, with lots of other things, where a virtual environment might actually be an advantage over a physical environment. So, you know, I think while we accept that all of us want to be in nature and so on and so forth, I think we should also not be sweeping and ableist in those assumptions. Scott asks, can you speak to the benefits and pitfalls of technological tools and virtual presentations, renderings, or VR in the process of client communication?
May I?
I'd
love to
go ahead.
I'd love to jump in on that. I mean, I am somebody who lives with you know, a marker, a pen, a pencil in hand, and when I am in my pitch mode, it is very much about the tactile piece of paper and the drawing that I'm able to throw across the table and to say, is this what you're thinking about? The studies have been, you know, done, and so many of them that say that when a group of people is discussing an idea, the moment that somebody says, I don't know what everybody's thinking, but I'm sort of seeing this as a triangle. The moment that happens, the efficiency of the conversation is not double, it's like triple or 4 times more efficient, because suddenly everybody's saying, well, okay, but if that's a triangle, then I'm this point of it over here, or I'm that point. So that way of just being able to sketch and be tactile is really, really, really important. I do think, I mean, I'm snapping shots all the time and sharing them to the screen in a Zoom call. It's very useful if I'm the one talking to be able to have my extraordinary team there, so that when I'm across the continent and draw something and snap it and I send it to them, and they're doing the mechanics of putting it up there, so I'm not breaking the flow and the eye contact, because each of those little things takes time. But yeah, that's just a piece of it. I so believe in being able to begin something with a piece of paper and a pen, and I love all the other tools as well, or pencil even, but.
I think the challenge that I think it was Scott what was asking about is you answer the question perfectly, because there's that spontaneity, and the answer is evolving in the moment contextually. So I would recommend to people who they should certainly use the tools that Michael just talked about. But if you need to show a deck of slides, make it as short as you possibly can.
Oh, yeah.
Points for every slide you do not show. And the linearity of slide decks is actually really problematic, because it's not a kind of branching natural experience, nor is it particularly, there aren't a lot of openings for conversation. So the platform that we're using right now is challenged that way. But so is sitting in a conference room and showing people a PowerPoint.
We only have time for one more question here. So I think, Rob, we're going to get you in there. We have a question here about, it's a huge grab bag question, but I'm going to let you pick whatever you want from it. What opportunities do you see for artificial intelligence, machine learning, and augmented design workflows? And I think all of those three technologies are kind of getting at the same thing, which is, augmenting decision-making processes in design. So Rob, maybe you want to respond to that, because I think that's a piece we haven't really talked about today. And that would be great for us to address.
Yeah, you're right, that is a grab bag. We've got we're doing a lot of machine learning internally at SOM, actually, to try and rev designs and get the algorithms to sort of understand what it is that is being done. Machine learning and AI in general can always be applied to solid structure objects, right? So you've got templates and patterns that you work from. And then you make adjustments for environmental changes. You make adjustments for budget. You make there are a dozen switches and levers and knobs that you can pull, and the AI can help guide you. I think that you do not want to completely remove the human from the equation. And again, this is speaking as a non-architect, because the human will they'll put the brass knobs on the doors for you and make sure everything is polished and looking just fine. Whereas if you rely on AI and machine learning too much, you can come up with something that just winds up being uniform, which the client may not want. I do talk to friends in the auto industry, and when they apply AI and machine learning and just let it go, we all wind up with the Ford Fiesta. There's an optimal design for like airflow and fuel consumption and what have you, right? And so that's something that should be avoided. But it's absolutely a major component of everything that we're looking at internally, and I'm sure that Dawn and Michael are doing exactly the same thing.
Thank you all so much. I mean, I'm sorry to everybody who hasn't been able to have a question answered today. We did have a lot of questions, but also I think our panelists really took a deep and quite, considered approach to many of the questions here. And I'm glad they've had the time to develop the responses that they did, because I think what I'm at least walking away with is this metaphor of technology as linked to craft, really. And I think, Dawn, you brought this up, but it kind of ties into almost everything, right? There's an approach and a philosophy to technology that we need to take. Just as Rob just said, decision-making processes still need the human touch. We still need to understand the value of experience. Michael is working on that as well. I think that taking that kind of light approach to technology, understanding that we're dealing with a series of basically skills and crafts that we have to develop, but they're based on history, as Michael said. There are things from experiences that we already know that we need to take into this new normal with us in order to make sure that we're not leaving people behind, that we're addressing, that we're not losing fidelity. Again, a great concept that came up during this conversation, and that we're instead creating some kind of new experience that could possibly enrich the lives of many people through the work that we do. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and thanks to our panelists today, Rob DeMillo from SOM, Dawn Weinreich from Ennead Architects, and Michael Beneville from Beneville Studios. This has been phenomenal. Thank you so much. I've learned a lot. I feel like I've come on a journey today. So thank you for your time, and hope to be in touch with all of you virtually or in real life very soon. And thanks so much for our attendees for joining us. This has been wonderful. Good afternoon. The most tech-enabled, the most efficiently designed building in the world is of no use if it does not support the health, well-being, comfort, and safety of the people who use it. So next up, we have a brief address from one of the global leaders of the healthy building movement, Rachel Hodgdon, the president of the International Well Building Institute.
I want to start off with a little story here. So picture this. It's the end of February 2020. I call my father and I say, I'm canceling my trip to Asia. I won't be able to meet up with you and mom in Vietnam next week. This virus is serious. I think you need to cut your vacation short and come home. We're fine, he assures me. Don't worry. I know the news sounds scary, but everything here seems totally under control. Everyone wears a mask and we get temperature scanned wherever we go. You don't understand, I say. This virus is making its way to the US. It's probably already touched down. You might not be able to make it home if you wait much longer. I've got more than 20 staff members in China who have been on lockdown for several weeks already. They can't leave their houses. We should all be preparing to spend the next several months in lockdown. I think you're overreacting, he says. I hang up with my father and turn my attention to work matters. Our inaugural WELL conference is scheduled for next month, and it's becoming clear that we are going to have to cancel it. And what about our team in New York City? Are we all ready to be working from home? How are we going to care for all of our people throughout this crisis? My story is not unlike many of your stories, but it was a story that began several weeks earlier than most COVID tales here in the US. Thanks to our team in Asia, we not only had a sense of the trajectory of the virus, we also had a massive head start on understanding how it was spreading and the critical role that buildings and organizations would play in the fight against COVID-19. Our team members there kicked off our organization-wide effort to parse through every piece of research we could get our hands on, every scientific report that was issued. We started aligning what we were learning about COVID-19 and how it was spreading to the feature requirements in the well building standard. Increased ventilation and filtration, check. Separately ventilated bathrooms, check. Enhanced cleaning protocols, check. Emergency preparedness plans, mental health support, adequate healthcare benefits, sick leave, and support for community immunity through vaccines, check, check, and check. Our team in China started organizing webcasts to organize and educate their community on these science-based interventions that reached more than 125,000 individuals in the space of a few weeks. The work that they began in researching COVID-19 specific solutions was then picked up by our in-house team of researchers, public health masters and PhDs, building scientists, and engineers. By the time we closed our office doors on March 12th and sent everyone at IWBI HQ to work from home for the foreseeable future, we were already hard at work on solutions for slowing the spread and educating our global community on how to empower buildings and those who operate and maintain them as frontline caregivers in the fight against COVID-19. We stood up a task force, 600 volunteers from our community, epidemiologists, infectious disease specialists, public health researchers, facilities managers, designers, architects, and engineers raised their hands to volunteer. The effort was chaired by renowned experts from Joe Allen, head of the Healthy Buildings Program at Harvard, to former US Surgeon General Dr. Richard Carmona, to the previous head of the China CDC. We stood up a portal for these contributors to dive deep into the relevant well features and tell us what needed to be added and what needed to be strengthened to make buildings the first line of defense in the fight against this deadly virus. We hosted convenings for the co-chairs and a series of town halls for task force participants, sometimes late at night or early in the morning, to accommodate for our volunteers that hailed from more than 25 countries and many different time zones. And from this incredible bunch of experts and thousands of points of feedback, and from our relentless review of every piece of data and research we could get our hands on, came several conclusions. Number one, this was an airborne virus, and thus the majority of people who were contracting the virus were contracting it inside. So how we manage air is paramount to reducing the risk of transmission. Number two, that the toll that this would take on the mental health of our global population would be immense, and in the end will cost businesses and nations more than the virus itself in terms of healthcare costs, sick days, and lost productivity. Number three, that as with virtually every public health crisis that we have faced in the past and will face in the future, those who have the least suffer the most. And finally, four, that well held up really well in light of everything that we were learning. There were very few changes that needed to be made to the standard to stand up to this virus. We published an initial list of strategies culled from the well building standard that covered everything from emergency response planning to specifications for MERV filters. We hosted webcasts with experts that drew as many as 3,000 registrants per session. We rapidly stood up short-term advisories for hard-hit sectors like hotels, hospitality, sports, and entertainment to help them with their particular needs and challenges. We created free educational courses for office workers, teachers, and poll workers to empower them with simple strategies for protecting themselves and others in the midst of the pandemic. But our customers kept coming back and asking for more. We received emails and calls from multiple customers with a very specific ask to create a well designation to meet the moment, one that would address acute health threats in the built environment, COVID-19 especially, through shifts in building operations and management. And that was how the Well Health Safety Rating was born. We extricated the features from the well building standard that were most relevant and created a new scorecard to support a new offering. Our team created and launched this product in less than 30 days because we already had most of what we needed in the well building standard itself. And just as they promised, the market embraced it. It took us 66 months to register 600 million square feet of space for well certification. It took us less than 6 months to enroll that same amount of square footage to the Well Health Safety Rating. Today, over 1 billion square feet are enrolled to pursue the health safety rating, and thousands of buildings and spaces have already achieved it. From the iconic Empire State Building to Yankee Stadium to Fairfax County Public Schools to every bank branch, corporate office, and other space that houses JP Morgan Chase employees. We were so distressed to see that something as simple as wearing a mask to protect yourself and others could become politicized here in the US and in some other countries. And we saw an opportunity to increase public awareness around best practices for making a safe return to the new normal, whatever that is, and to help our customers get back to business. Have you seen the Look for the Seal commercials with Lady Gaga and J-Lo and Michael B. Jordan and Venus Williams and Wolfgang Puck and Deepak Chopra and Dr. Carmona on television? Those are ours. We created a consumer awareness campaign to leverage the voices and platforms of celebrities and other influencers to create a kind of trickle-up effect to get teachers, parents, home buyers, employees, shoppers, travelers, and taxpayers to ask that their health and safety be prioritized through science-based measures, to look for the seal and ask for the seal. We know that throughout history, pandemics, particularly those caused by airborne disease, have brought public health professionals together with the design and architecture community. But the cautionary tale is that once a vaccine or a cure is discovered, those communities often fracture, and we go back to our old ways of being, doing, and operating. We cannot afford to have this happen again. And our campaign is one of a number of ways that IWBI is trying to keep the connection between buildings and our health alive and well. Our team often says that having a sense of purpose kept us sane and committed to our work throughout this trying period. We've been so grateful to find ourselves in the eye of a storm, to have day jobs that are actually a part of the solution. Our global team is spread across at least 9 countries, and many of us have said that we feel more connected to one another and to our customers than we ever have. We feel like we showed up to the challenge and our community met us there. The other day, my wife and I were taking our COO Pratik Khanna's 5-year-old daughter Ajuni to get ice cream in New York City. And she stopped in the middle of the sidewalk and said, "Look, Ray Ray, a Well Health Safety seal." She had spotted a seal mounted to the door of one of those bank branches. It was such a small moment, but it brought me to tears because of the gravity of all that we have been through and all that we have accomplished as a team and a community. It all set in. We haven't much slowed down in the last year and a half, and we don't intend to slow down in the months to come either. The work is just too important and the opportunity too great. We have a new advisory in motion, the Health Equity Advisory, a group of more than 100 experts in diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, and universal design, including Avi, Metropolis editor-in-chief and our host today, to help us think about the ways in which WELL can support buildings and organizations in leveling the playing field and creating inclusive environments for all. Out of that advisory, we'll launch a new rating, the WELL Health Equity Rating. Like the Well Health Safety Rating, once launched, buildings and organizations can achieve this rating as a standalone designation or on the journey toward a full WELL certification or score. The social determinants of health tell us that where we sit and who we sit next to, our physical and social environments, have a greater impact on our state of health than our access to healthcare, our genetics, and our lifestyle and behaviors combined. And the pandemic has underscored this. Take vaccines, for instance. In the United States, the greatest determinant of whether you will get vaccinated or not depends on where you sit and who you sit next to. Our physical and social environments shape our choices, and in doing so, they have a profound impact on our health, well-being, and safety. Imagine spaces and places that welcome everyone in, that nudge us toward better, more healthful choices, and equip us all to live the healthiest versions of our lives. We're also hard at work on a new application of Well for homes, whether it's because you were cooped up in your house for the better part of a year or because you're afraid to set foot in a grocery store or an elevator. All of us are profoundly more aware of the impact that the places and spaces where we live our lives have on our ability to thrive, or in the case of the pandemic, to survive. Even before the pandemic, we spent more than 90% of our time indoors, and the majority of that time is spent in our homes. We've already created a solution for healthy, affordable housing in the United States through our partnership with enterprise community partners. Pre-pandemic, we spent over a year working behind the scenes with the enterprise team to merge our well building standard criteria with the enterprise community certification, which is the leading certification for green affordable housing in the US. That means that every affordable housing project that certifies and achieves both an enterprise green community certification and a well certification gets a double branded plaque. And dozens of states either mandate or incentivize this criteria for state-funded affordable housing projects. So we'll leverage what we've learned through our partnership with Enterprise and what we're learning through nearly 100 volunteers who are participating in our Well Homes Advisory to create new pathways in Well for single-family homes and optimize existing pathways for multifamily homes to make sure that our homes can be places of respite with excellent air and water quality, abundant daylight, sound acoustics, and healthier materials. Homes that are comfortable, conducive to sleep, conducive to work for the many of us who will continue to work from home long after the pandemic has subsided, and most of all, conducive to raising a healthy family. We're targeting middle-income housing because we think that homes that are healthy and well should be available to all and not just a few. But one-off builds will also be able to well certify too. My mom and dad made it back from Asia safe and sound, and I got married during the pandemic. And the four of us, me, my wife, my mom, and dad, just closed on a piece of land yesterday. Like so many of you, this pandemic reminded us of what matters most, each other. And we're planning to build a multi-generational home that we hope will be one of the very first well-certified homes in the world. Thanks so much for having me and letting me tell this story for the first time on camera, and hope that the rest of the sessions go great for all.
One of the basic tenets of the well building standard is to ensure the health, safety, and well-being of all people who use the spaces that we design. But the COVID-19 crisis has put that into sharp relief. People with disabilities and senior citizens, for example, have had to navigate new health risks in the spaces where they live and work. But at the same time, remote working has opened up opportunities for people who were previously excluded from the workforce. So at this time, as we stand 30 years after the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act, we ask, how can we shape a more inclusive and accessible future for the spaces that we design? Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Metropolis Forum's webinar, The Pandemic is a Portal for Inclusivity. I'm Avinash Rajagopal, the editor-in-chief of Metropolis magazine. Today's event was inspired by a quote from the writer Arundhati Roy in the Financial Times when she wrote a piece called The Pandemic is a Portal, talking about how all pandemics in the history of humankind have been portals, and we can choose to either walk through this portal carrying behind us our prejudices and our greed, or we can walk through it to a better world. Our sessions are about what is that better world that we can hope for beyond the current pandemic. Crises like COVID-19 reveal both challenges and opportunities for marginalized groups. As we've seen, the pandemic has taken a toll on our most vulnerable populations, affecting people of different races, abilities, ages in different ways. People with disabilities and senior citizens now have to guard against new challenges, but the pandemic might also open new possibilities and might also bring the rest of society a new sensitivity to the challenges that many of us face every day, even in non-pandemic times. How can architects and designers embrace equity and inclusion for disabled, older, and other vulnerable populations as we plan for the future? To help us answer that question, we have an amazing group of panelists today. We have with us Karen Breitmeyer, who is the founder of Studio Pacifica, consulting with many large corporations, as well as architecture and design firms on how to build a more inclusive and accessible built environment. We also have with us Vanna Whitney, who's Associate Principal at Lady Mayton Stacey Architects. Also on the panel today is Bess Williamson, Associate Professor of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, a design historian who has written about design for people with disabilities. Bess, I'd like to start with you. Your book, Accessible Middle America, is out in paperback this year from NYU Press. And we were lucky at Metropolis to have you write the cover story for our May 2020 issue. Has the pandemic given you any new insights as you advocate for more accessible or inclusive spaces?
Hi, thank you. Yes, to both of those questions. Of course, the pandemic has brought so much change and kind of uncertainty that I think really fundamentally shift our sense of what design is, right? Our ideas of planning years and decades into the future, have been challenged in so many ways as our priorities have completely shifted in our everyday lives in so many ways. But I think in many ways, I look to a number of disabled writers, thinkers, advocates who have pointed out the ways in which disabled people were often already living some of the practices of the pandemic, being aware of the instability of public infrastructure and of personal health as something that is sometimes not recognized by institutions. And in a practical sense, many of the tools that we're all using, like Zoom, for example, video, remote ways of working, are things that disabled people have been using or have been asking for a long time and often haven't been granted as kind of standard practice. And so the ways that this shifts our sense of like, where do we work or what do we see into people's lives through their remote work, have their echoes in disability culture. So I think in a lot of ways, the promising, like the positive story that I see is an awareness that our sense of like how work happens and how life happens, how socialization happens, and it opens up our kind of sense of the arbitrariness of what we consider to be normal ways of practice. At the same time, I think more recently I'm seeing more and more evidence that these lessons are not necessarily being taken as long-term change, that as people go back to work, the doors are like closing back up again on who has access, on who has to reveal aspects of their personal life in order to get access. And, on a bigger picture way, if we think about the things like labor laws and the safety of workers, that these are being kind of weakened, like snuck into various policy proposals. So there's even more perhaps of an urgency to being aware that these issues are political. They're not just practical or just functional, that there's questions of power and inequity that are built into them.
Right, absolutely. I mean, I think all of us are looking to some extent, regardless of how much agency we have in shaping the built environment that we quote unquote return to, although I don't think that there's going to be such a clear-cut return. We are all looking forward to some kind of protocol making, some kind of guideline, some kind of larger consideration of some basic rules and principles that we all need to follow as we norm back into society. And one of the things that we've tried to highlight at least in Metropolis is that we don't want business as usual, because business as usual is flawed. And so how do we return to a better environment? And as you're saying, I think we need to recognize that force of habit is strong. I mean, we made some radical changes in how we work because of this pandemic, but we're also just as ready to spring back given a chance. And some things we shouldn't necessarily spring back on quite so easily. Vanna, I'd love to bring you in on here. At Lady Mayton Stacey Architects, you've worked with a lot of different vulnerable populations. You've worked on housing for people who are recently homeless, people who face mental challenges, people of different income groups. Do you have some kind of strategy or some kind of approach that you adopt to make sure that people who are not necessarily used to having their voice heard are included in the architectural process?
Absolutely, Avi. One of the things that we really enjoy about our practice is that early engagement we get to do with the members of our community that are marginalized in different ways. That is some of the most powerful moments before we start the design even, is to have a roundtable. For example, we worked on a building in downtown San Francisco that has 120 units of housing for people who were formerly homeless. We brought together a roundtable to do a charrette on just all the different goals that the different user groups have, the Department of Health and Human Services and the service providers, who knew who the end users would be. We also do interviews with potential clients who are going to be using spaces. So a campus for adults with autism, for example, doing interviews with the families and with the adults to hear about what the specific and common challenges are. And, you know, having post-occupancy evaluations where we go back and talk to people who are living in the buildings and asking them about what's working, what's not. And even that is an interesting design challenge about how to get an equity of voices, because there's always some loud voice that wants to sort of drown out the others. And so even designing a POE is part of our process. So we find that some of the equally invigorating to the other design parts of our practice.
Right. Vanna, before I move on, I just want to follow up on that. I think what you bring up is such an important point. You know, it's not just about research. It's not just about stakeholder engagement at the start of a project, but also, you know, at the other end of the project, you know, once it's, so to speak, completed, right? So how do we continue to learn from mistakes even on a single project? How do we learn project to project? I think that's really important. A quick question I have is, how has that engagement process changed during COVID-19? Obviously, your projects have installed, and I know that at Lady Maitum Stacey, a significant number of your projects do include, you know, people from underserved populations and vulnerable populations. So how are you continuing to engage with them during this time when even, you know, simple day-to-day, you know, communication is a challenge? How do you have specialized, engaged communication around your projects?
Well, interesting that you asked that now, Avi, because we're in the middle of a bunch of community outreach for a number of projects early on. And doing that, you usually go out and actually get to meet people face to face, which we love because, you know, you get to see body language as well as voices, and that's a richer context. But being able to transition to a digital platform has actually brought more people that we normally wouldn't have been able to come to the meetings, either due to time constraints or other barriers, show up to the meeting. So that's been exciting to see. And it's also, you know, allowed us to be more creative. So before we used to come with boards and verbal presentations, we've now been able to do videos and get feedback on those videos. And so being able to, while we lose some of the richness of being in person, we can find ways to add richness back by offering things like videos where we might have had something static before. And with any group interaction, you know, there's room for improvement, of course. You always want to get an equity of voices. That's always one of the key components of that. And having chat rooms, for example, is a great way to have even the quieter people bring up their concerns and comments.
Right. That's, you know, that's again, you know, in the vein of what we were saying right at the start of this discussion, that, you know, it's possible that this pandemic will bring us opportunities. As Bess reminded us, it's up to us to make sure that we keep those systems in place even when they are not quote unquote necessary, because of course for many populations they have always been necessary. We've just never acknowledged that or mainstreamed that. Karen, I'd love to bring you in here. You've consulted with, you know, as we said, you know, many corporations. We've consulted with architecture firms, people like you know, Perkins and Will, you know, so I just want to understand, you know, as you advocate for, you know, accessible spaces, I've also heard you advocate for more people with disabilities actually entering architecture as a profession. Why is that important as well?
Well, we believe very strongly that engaging people with lived experience brings a richness to your project. And I think certainly community engagement, like Vanna's doing, is a very important part of bringing all the kinds of stakeholders, if you use that term, to the table. But I believe that by engaging a more diverse design team, hopefully including people who share the same lived experience as the end user, that you're going to create a more rich, a better design product. And I just feel like maybe this pandemic, one of the great things is it's demonstrated to many design firms that you can indeed have staff that work at home or work in alternate circumstances and are doing a great job. I mean, I know my staff, some of whom had 1 hour long commutes, are now very happy to have a much shorter at-home commute. And we're getting work done and doing a good job at it. So maybe we can more successfully accommodate people who wish for, I guess you might call it, alternative employment opportunities, and that they can bring their skills and talents and great ideas to the project. So yes, I am a huge advocate of expanding the profession to be more diverse in all sorts of ways, but in particular, adding more people with disabilities.
Right. I think, what you're talking about with people with disabilities is an argument that we've made with all kinds of diverse groups. Of course, we know the abysmal stats on the number of Black architects, in the profession. We're still at about 2%. We know the stats on the number of women in the profession. And when you get to women in leadership, that's, sad numbers as well. And for people with disabilities, that number is even still lower. And so we certainly have a lot of catching up to do in terms of having those diverse voices represented, not just, in our process as architects and designers, as Vanna laid out, but also in our offices, in the teams that we work in, I think, as you're saying, Karen. But of course, all of this needs to be situated within a framework of good policy, best practices for the profession, as Bess reminded us. We have a couple of questions from the audience here. Again, I want to remind everyone we will be taking questions throughout, so please go ahead and use the Q&A button and send us your questions. I just want to thank this opportunity again. Use this opportunity again to thank Vanna Whitney from Lady Mason Stacy Architects, Karen Breckmeyer from Studio Pacifica, and Bess Williamson from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago for joining us today. I'd like to get started on one question before we go to the audience questions. And Bess, it would be great if you could jump in on this, given your historical sweep on this topic, and then I'd love to get Karen and Vanna in as well. It's been 30 years since the ADA was passed. This July actually marks the 30th anniversary of the actual signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. How can inclusive and accessible design go from being seen as a checklist to really being seen as an opportunity, a design opportunity, much as sustainability, I think, is being seen now, or other sort of things that were seen originally as strictures are now being seen as creative outlets? How do we get accessible design to that point, Bess?
It's a good question. Oh, sorry, Karen, did you want to jump in?
Go ahead, Bess.
I'm very enthusiastic to hear the perspective for practicing architects, right? For me as a historian, critic, it's easy for me to say that there needs to be significant cultural change in the practices of architecture and planning, that the lack of, I think I'll speak historically, right? That the arguments around improving access have not changed dramatically in about 50 years, right? So once there's kind of a cultural shift in the broader world, and especially in the US, toward accepting the idea that disabled people should be part of public life, right? Whether it's because they're disabled veterans or people who had survived the polio epidemic, another pandemic that dramatically changed kind of the status of disability in the world, or a civil rights movement of the later 20th century, right? There's a shift in attitude. And so the argument is like, so one reason to change architecture that has often been discussed and continues to be discussed is that it's kind of common sense, right? That this is better design. That if you install the ramp from the beginning, you won't have to add it later, it won't be awkward, or you won't face tremendous public embarrassment, as we can think of, recent projects that have gone, these are kind of the practicality arguments, and I think they hold strong, right? And there's often a kind of light bulb, I think, for architects who realize, like, once you sort of know these tools, they're often tools of better design. But I think there's also a kind of deeper engagement that leads to more long-term change. And this is why in the article that I wrote for Metropolis, I highlighted 3 buildings, including the Ed Roberts Center that Vanna's firm designed, that are built from the ground up for inclusion because they are institutions that are run by and for disabled people. And I think it's not just that their design is sort of appropriate to the audience, but their design processes included disabled people, as Karen mentioned, who are trained in design, or if they're not trained in design, understand design, have been thinking about, consulting on, and advocating around accessibility for decades. And that's much more than a one-time engagement that can happen. And so I think that deeper level cultural change, and I don't want to be too optimistic about this horrifying situation that our world and especially our country are in as far as the pandemic, but one shift that I hope will happen is an understanding that health is not a static thing, right? It changes based on what kind of environment we're in, whether we feel safe or not, right? Whether we feel accepted or comfortable or not. And that can reflect in design from the smallest level to the biggest kind of big picture, big budget types of projects.
Right.
That's my take on that.
Karen, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. I think that when I went to architecture school, the best practice, the highest standard was to design beautiful spaces for people. And I've always thought that people, the word people, includes everybody. And because your ability or your sensory status or whatever changes over your lifespan, I think we need to recognize that buildings need to serve people over all ages, and disability is a natural part of the human experience. There are people with disabilities in every community, every age, it's just part of us as humans. And so if we can create beautiful spaces that accommodate everybody, that's kind of the highest goal, I think, of what architecture should be. So like I like to say, architects, designers of all kinds, we have the power. We have the power to include or potentially exclude people. And it's not just people with disabilities. I mean, it can, all sorts of other marginalized communities can be excluded, however inadvertently. But I think we need to take responsibility for that power and do good work with it. And then, how do you learn more? How do you know if you're doing the right thing? Well, that's where engaging people who have experience, like an understanding, a special understanding, is useful. Whether, and my hope would be, that they would join your design team.
Exactly. Vanna, do you want to comment on that? How do we consider checklists as creative opportunities? And then we'll go to audience questions after you.
Actually, I'd love to jump in on sort of piggyback on what Karen was saying, but also kind of take what you were saying earlier, Avi, and say, how can we transition from checklists and into integrative design and inclusivity. And piggybacking on what Karen was saying, like, one thing that we hold dear in our practice is that everybody deserves great design, no qualifications. Like, we don't want to have a world where we're, and I think we've been moving away from that in the design world, but our firm has been working very hard to not have discussions about that's a great sustainable building, or that's a great affordable building, or a great accessible building, but that is a great design. And part of being a great design is it means you've served your community. And so that really takes you away from that checklist. You might use checklists in sort of a back office way to make sure that you have gone through all the processes you need to be thorough in your investigation and in your discussions with people. But really, we need to remember to keep looking at design as the key focus, not only as it being great and beautiful, but serving the needs of the community at the same time. And so in that, I think some of the key things we do is look for design solutions that achieve a nice compromise when there are two competing needs, because as Karen was pointing out, there's a wide variety of marginalized communities, and in even one subgroup, there's a wide variety of goals, challenges, needs, opportunities. So mitigating those tensions is also a key part of the design process, as well as just in Mission Bay, right up near the San Francisco Bay. So we're raising the ground floor of the building to mitigate against sea level rise. Really important. Now, at the same time, we really want to keep that building as totally accessible. So those are two mitigating circumstances, trying to keep the ramps going. So finding a compromised height for that is a good solution. We do other things, like in Berkeley, we're working on a campus for homelessness, and designing a really lush green garden at the front of the building gives something back to the neighborhood that's already a little bit concerned that we're building in their neighborhood. Provides a warm and welcoming presence to people who are coming in, and really invites people to come in. It's an opportunity for water filtration, and it's a discouragement against encampment. The last thing the service groups that are working there want to do is have to see people get asked to move on. They want people to come in and access services and come in. So I think finding multiple solutions, opportunities, and finding good compromises that serve a broader community are great goals.
Right. Absolutely. I think one of the most heartening things from my point of view that I've been seeing happen in the architecture and design world is really the coming together of standards and certifications and things like that over a broad range of issues. So for instance, we have sustainability certifications like the Living Building Challenge, really recognizing equity as an important aspect of sustainability. We're seeing wellness standards like the Well Building Standard, really take on accessibility and equity as part of wellness writ large. And I think, we have to understand that, building inequitable spaces or unsustainable spaces are bad for everyone. And sustainability in itself can also be a powerful tool for equity, but we also have to consciously consider equity as part of our and inclusivity in our goals. So the more we see our standards for the profession kind of merge, the more we see our ethics and guidelines merge and become multidimensional rather than unidimensional, I think the better we're all going to be. I'm gonna bring in some questions from the audience. The first one, I don't want to put any of our panelists on the spot, but one of our attendees asked, which would you say are some large firms setting the best example in accessible design? Let me take out the large firms qualifier there. Certainly we're open to many firms. Any examples of great accessible design? And Bana, I think you have to plead out of this question. But Karen and Bess, any great examples of recent accessible design?
It would be hard for me to pick particular projects because I'm working with so many firms and they're doing such a great job that if I pick some, I might leave somebody out. But I know that a couple of projects that been published in Metropolis. The renovation of the Seattle Space Needle by Olson Kundig just turned out beautifully. That's a great job. We've done some really creative projects with, let's see, large firms. With a firm, Grand Baba here in Seattle, that's doing a lot of hospitality and retail and just really thinking outside of the box. But there are lots of firms, I think, doing good work. So, I'm always sort of stuck. Yes, have you got any ideas?
Yeah, I'll jump in here and I'll say, first of all, present company. So, Karen, my understanding of your work is because you're consulting, your name's not on the project, right? And so that also speaks a little bit to the problem of whose building is the best building, right? Is that so many people work on these buildings and it's not one person, right? But just to call out, for those in the audience who might not be familiar with the project that Vanna worked on, the Ed Roberts campus in Berkeley, which is a nonprofit communal building that has multiple nonprofits that work in relationship to disability rights, that in a place that's really the birthplace of an organized national disability rights movement in the US. And so it's this top of the line, beautiful building. It's one of so few buildings that we can point to and be like, this is an amazing, beautiful, well photographed kind of building, which speaks to a variety of issues, right? We can think of, but it's something that's my students also often ask, and which I ask of my students, what are our great accessible buildings? And that our great buildings by great architects tend not to be concerned with accessibility. If they are accessible, it might be sort of by accident. Whatever firm actually, implemented the design might have done that, right? But we're more familiar with what accessibility goes wrong. And so, yeah, so sort of the problem. So but just to sort of add to the name. So, I can never quite get the firm name. Letty, Madam
Stacy.
Yeah, thank you. I also, I think is a little bit less well known here in Chicago. And again, I think I may get the name wrong, but where Jack Catlin, who was another disabled architect who has, sort of came from advocacy and personal experience into the field, who've done a lot of projects, including Access Living, which is sort of the disability rights and advocacy center here in Chicago, as well as Chris Downey, a blind architect who is one of the directors of the Lighthouse for the Blind in San Francisco, right? So you have these examples of firms who have been able to sort of contribute distinctively to these higher profile projects, but I think we still are in search of those ideal buildings, and maybe they would be, as Vanna mentioned, something that's a project that's integrated into a center around homelessness, right? Something that's integrated into a broader project and not just one building standing alone, because that in itself suggests something that might be more difficult. So, as typical professor in me, that I'm let's think about the question, but that I think it's sometimes very hard to see what those projects really are. And how accessible they are unless you're there or unless you're able to talk to the people that were involved in it.
Right, absolutely. I think certainly we're still in search, I think, Bess, as you're saying, we're in search of projects that make accessibility and inclusivity a central concern or a creative impetus, going back to the original question that we were talking about just a few minutes ago. I have a question here from Susan McNabb. Online engagement, how do you include those that are digitally less able to be connected? What does technology equity look like in our world?
Well, I'll talk to that one since we do a bunch of community engagement, and that's a real impediment. There's no getting around it. People rely on other community members that are around them to help them access digital platforms, whether it be a neighbor or a family member or a community resource. So I think that's key. And it's not just ability with digital platforms, it's also access to internet. Access to Wi-Fi is a real concern. And so I think that's an opportunity for funding groups to look at ways to make sure that we can fund access to good internet in our affordable projects, whether it's housing or services or something like that. The digital platform does provide us a neat opportunity that's sort of a parallel to this, which is we are able to get translators into our community engagement. So we just recently did some community engagement down in Sunnyvale, and we had Cantonese and Spanish simultaneously translated for that project, which would have been much harder to do in person. So that was a real opportunity. But on the digital platform side, the workarounds still involve other people and better wireless access and access to computers, certainly.
Right. I have a question here for Karen. Alexa Von Brainard asks, I'm a deaf landscape designer, and it's very rare to find other disabled folks in the landscape profession. I'm wondering how you got more involved in access consultancy, and what do you recommend for disabled folks in design fields who are just starting out? How can we continue our own work within our offices to continue to push for even more universal design?
I once was the only person with disability in a large office, and I know personally how difficult it is to be that only voice, and to be asking the questions that sometimes people are not as receptive to. I think, though, that you just have to keep plugging and be sort of gentle and persistent, and help people see the inclusive nature of universal design and good accessible design. I believe that when clients see the value and how many people in our community benefit from it, that they that they will start asking for it more. In terms of how did I actually become a consultant as my sort of day job, it really came incrementally. For a long time, I was what you might call traditional practicing architect, and then I just got more and more consulting projects. So it was not an overnight change. I think one thing that I would encourage anybody who's listening who might be a designer with disabilities, I think we need to find a way to come together and kind of be in communication with each other so that we can share, so that some of us who've been doing it longer can help some of the folks who are younger. And I know it's very, very hard to enter the design profession with a disability, because I was told no many times. I just happened to not pay attention to those no's and kept going, which I kind of encourage you to do too, if that's what you're thinking. So don't let that high school counselor tell you you can't be an architect if you can't climb a ladder or swing a hammer. Yes, you can. But I think it would be great to find, and I would like to figure out if I don't know whether it's AIA or some multidisciplinary group that could help us come together as a community and figure out how to do better and get more engaged.
Right. Certainly, to the extent that Metropolis can help with that effort, we would love to be involved. And Alexa, if you want to be connected to Karen, just let us know. You'll get a follow-up email after this session, and you can just reply and say, hey, connect me to Karen. We'll do it for you. Chip Young asks, can you share some top design ideas, so design strategies that have worked beyond aspirations beyond the minimum ADA standards that you believe can help a building or interior designer communicate that this is a building dedicated to all people? Vanna, you want to jump in on that one?
Sure, I would love to. So of course, we'll bring up the Ed Roberts campus that both Beth and Karen have brought up. That building, of course, we had the great opportunity to work with all these different disability activists, rights groups, and there, the main feature, like the design feature for the building, is the accessible ramp up to the second floor. So it really democratizes motion through the building. It also has glass facade, so it invites people to see this striking sculptural element, invites people in, and so it creates a connection with the whole community and the community inside, even though the community inside is quite specialized. It's become a space that the community sees as one of its buildings. And I've actually been to some fundraisers there. I've heard that there have been weddings there. It's created this sort of gathering space. So, you know, we're so happy to see how the building's being used right now. Some other solutions we've come up with is we came up with this thing that we fondly called Main Street at the very ground and heart of one of our buildings that's serving formerly homeless individuals. It's a 12-foot wide corridor that's flanked by all the key services that draw people back and forth into that space every day, with the idea of increasing opportunities for connection, because isolation is a real concern when you move from a community on the street to an individual apartment with a door. And also that big wide corridor provides a space for different mobility devices to pass easily and still stop and have a conversation and not feel like you're in the way. The other thing it provides is a nice overflow space. So we have some sliding doors for some flexible space there. So now we have indoor-outdoor space for that area. And if you're more comfortable with your device being in the covered area, you can still participate in what's happening right outside. We're happy to see how that's being used as well in the building.
Right. I think just underlying what you're saying, you know, one is, of course, to, if you are thinking of accessible aspects or features to your space, be proud of them. You know, make them central to the building, not an afterthought, because, you know, people of all abilities will enjoy them and use them. Certainly people of all ages will enjoy them and use them as well. As Karen pointed out, we go through a journey of different abilities through our lifetime. So, you know, if you want to design a building that's for people that throughout their life, then, you know, you need to do that. And the second thing, as you said, I think, is to understand what are some of those social features that might be translated into building design that are specific to the needs of the community that the building is serving. And I know designers do this all the time, but, you know, to really embrace that as the heart of the project as well. So thank you, Vanna, for that. I just want to remind everyone, we're here today talking about how this pandemic, horrible as it is, can be a portal for greater inclusivity in architecture and design. And talking to us are Bess Williamson from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, Vanna Whitney from Lady Mate and Stacy Architects, and Karen Breitmeyer from Studio Pacifica. Thank you all so much for joining us. We have a question here about the blind community. One of our attendees asked, how do you see the pandemic impacting the blind community as it relates to the sense of touch for wayfinding? What changes do you see in the use of Braille in public spaces? You know, obviously we're all thinking a lot about surfaces and touching surfaces at this point in time. You know, how do we, is there a thought that I see Karen and Whitney, Karen and Vanna, you both have reactions to that. So if one of you wants to jump in.
I would be happy to jump in. I think there's still a lot of, there isn't a lot of good guidance, I think, out there on how best to communicate sort of the public health requirements to people in the blindness community. In my city, most of the retail stores are putting stickers on the floor to tell you how to maintain 6 feet of distance. This is not a tactile material, and therefore someone who can't see the sticker is going to have a really hard time determining where they are in space from people. And the idea that they're getting information only by tactile, you know, is a bit disconcerting for that community. So I think I would like to see more guidance. I know there's been information provided on how to alter our office and store in school environments, but they're been a little light on their information around how to support people with disabilities. I mean, and I don't think people realize that, for example, manual wheelchair users often have to push by gripping the tires on their chair. This means that any germ products that are on the ground are now on your hands. So how can we provide sanitation stations much more closely spaced, or in accessible places immediately as you enter the door, and do it in a consistent way so that people with vision limitations can find them. So there's still work to be done in this area, in my opinion.
Right. Jennifer Womack asks, do you have any thoughts about cases where universal design principles can't really be applied to architecture interiors, and what is standing in the way if so? So I'd like to translate that into what are some really wicked problems, as they used to say, things that are not easily solvable for accessibility. Bess, if you have any examples from your work as well, we'd love to hear.
Yes, well, I mean, I'll just use one of the most often referenced accessible architectural features, which is the curb cut, and the history of curb cuts is often referenced as a great example of universal design, right? People who don't use wheelchairs are quick to identify the positives of having curb cuts, right? That they help for strollers or for people who are pushing carts and so on. But the history actually shows us curb cuts aren't that simple, right? A curb cut has often, and the early curb cuts that were built, there was no guideline on how they should be built. They were kind of invented by whoever was constructing street level changes, and so they often were just the curbs smushed into the street. And for blind people who rely on being able to detect the edge of the curb, that became a problem. So in Berkeley, the kind of community that is the sort of precursor to the Ed Roberts campus were involved in this very issue. And I found it very interesting, I talk about this in my book, that the solution was not a universal solution. The solution was a compromise between the wheelchair using activists and their blind collaborators in that time, where they designed a curb cut that was very steep and outside of the crosswalk, with the idea that well, if curb cuts are problematic for blind people, we'll put them to the side. And that hasn't been the long-lasting example. Instead, we have curb cuts with various bumpy things, which themselves are kind of a compromise. This can be difficult for people who are using walkers or just having, have a difficult gait in some way, right? So, which is to say that universal design, I think the kind of myth of universal design is that the outcome should be a perfect solution for everyone. There is no universal design. There is no product that truly works for everyone. And instead, what we need is universal design philosophy or approaches that allow for flexibility, that allow for multiple options. And I just want to say, I'm completely cribbing from another great disabled architect, Ronald Mace, who coined the term universal design, whose work bore this out, right? He did not necessarily, he was not arguing that universal design equals no design or no accessible features. We'll never be able to see it. It will be seamless, right? But instead that our process should be looking for shared points. And I always argue, some of the most interesting design outcomes, to go back to the earlier question about sort of, great design approaches, that one of the interesting, one of the features at the Ed Roberts campus that people often comment on, Van, maybe you've heard this too, are the large elevator buttons at the bottom of the elevator. It immediately cues you in. So even if you're not coming in through the glass doors, you're coming up through the elevator, you're oh, this is an interesting building. There's a different way to interact with it. And that may be another form of universal design. And not every single person can use those buttons, right? If you can't stoop down or whatever. So there's another button there too. So just to say, I think the idea of competition can sometimes also lead to, multiple options, and that's a form of universal design as well.
Right. Thank you so much for invoking Ronald Mace. It wouldn't be right if this conversation happened without that. At NCSU, and I think his ideas of universal design have really been misinterpreted over and over again. When he was, as you rightly say, Bess, arguing for universal approaches, not universal outcomes. Connected to that, another question. Do panelists feel current ADA standards are enough? Do those standards need to be expanded? Do they need to encompass more aspects of buildings? So is the ADA limited? Is the problem just that it hasn't been applied in full, or is the problem that in itself, in its scope, it is inadequate? Karen.
So I'll go ahead and comment on that. I think the ADA, like any building code, is and should be an evolving document that continues to grow and change based on, I would hope, new research, new information, new thought processes based on the sort of the input of all the parties that are involved. The first edition came out in 1991. The second one, the ADA AG, came out in 2004 and was adopted in 2010. 2010. You know, we're maybe ripe for a few more changes. But I think there's no expectation that it's like done, because we have new information and new ways of kind of moving through the community, and we want that to be reflected in the document. So I'm looking forward to an opportunity to continue to evolve that.
Absolutely.
I'd love to. Oh.
Go ahead, Vanna. Go ahead, Vanna.
Oh, I just wanted to jump in and say, in addition to what Karen's saying, I think it's our responsibility as designers to design beyond code. Codes are baselines. We need to design beyond code when appropriate, when we're going to serve our community. Just like we need to design beyond the property line, not just design for who's in the building, but the community around it.
Absolutely. Thanks for that reminder, Vanna. I mean, I think that's the other thing, is that as I think underlying what Bess has said earlier in this conversation, and what both you and Karen have said as well, is that somehow for accessibility we seem to consider the ADA as like as like the maximum limit of what we need to do, when really, like all code in this world, it's the minimum of what one must be doing. So thank you so much for reiterating that. Kelly Beamon, who's actually one of the editors on my team, asks, is there any way that a more transparent RFP process might encourage accessible design solutions? Do we need more transparent or inclusive RFP processes? Dana, any thoughts on that?
Sure. We work a lot in San Francisco, and I think what perhaps the question is geared to is partly what Karen was bringing up, is being more inclusive of different people, that our community is reflected in the design team, right? How do we get towards that in the RFP process? And in San Francisco, there's this great system set up so that generally, at least the moment right now, it's open to anybody to go and apply, but you can only apply with a developer and a lead designer, architect. From there, there's this wide open process for selecting your design team that needs to meet qualifications of inclusiveness around size of business, minority status, gender status, that sort of thing. I think that could stand to be expanded here. I think what's obviously missing are disabilities, so maybe that's something that Karen and I can talk about in terms of the San Francisco area. But there are actually percentages every team is required to hit, which is an amazing thing. And we've been seeing that the teams that used to be brought in as part of the minority group to augment a team are now getting the job themselves. And of course, that was the intent all along. So it's not 100% perfect, of course, like all solutions, but it's a really important process, and it's an evolving one.
Yeah, I mean, it's something we need to pay attention to. Recently, there was an article, I think, about a project in London where the community being served was almost, was majority people of color or Black, and literally every team that was approved to submit proposals for the project were 100% white. And so I think that's the thing is, how do we look at the RFP process to better reflect the communities that the project is ultimately set up to serve. Kate's question on whether there are stellar examples of firms with inclusive teams that we can look to as a precedent. We spoke about that a little bit, about firms that have done inclusive work. I don't know if anybody knows of firms with inclusive teams, but if you can think of any now, let me know, and if not, we can definitely move on to the next question. Okay, we'll think about that a little bit more, and if at Metropolis we're able to do some research and put something together around that, we will. That's an interesting prompt for sure. Katie Guyton asks a question that I think has been asked of sustainability, of the wellness movement, of almost any movement to better architecture and design, which is when the conversation stops at, is it going to cost me more? How do you reframe the conversation to quote unquote justify the financial investment of inclusivity beyond it being the right thing to do? Is there a ROI on argument on a business case for inclusivity? Or is that even a dead end question to explore? Go ahead, Anna.
Well, what that brings to mind is just sort of the life cycle of a building, and is it going to be adaptable over the life cycle? So when you design with inclusivity in mind, and that's the goal, it's going to be able to serve more groups and more functions over the lifetime of that building. So that tends to indicate that life cycle costs you might be able to make a financial argument for it. Of course, the upfront costs might be something different. And I know we've already been handling this discussion in the world of sustainability, where we've actually done on some of my buildings back of envelope calculations of what it costs to add an enhanced thermal envelope so that we're conserving energy, so that the affordable housing doesn't have to pay high utility bills through the cycle of its life, and realize that within 12 years, it would have paid for itself. And so the developers had to go out and find the money for that, but they were able to do that because they had the long view in mind. And I think that with each challenge that we're facing, and we're looking at financial justifications, we need to do a deep dive search, because that is a real question that's going to always come up and often limits what, no matter what we design, what gets put into the building is, what fits into the budget. So having those financial justifications is so powerful. It's such an important tool.
Right. Before we move on, I just want to highlight a recommendation from Laurie Becker, who says that the Universal Design Summit Conference is going to be held May 2021, and to please follow the Universal Design Facebook group to sign up and stay in touch with inclusive design advocates. Thanks so much, Laurie, for that reminder. We'll certainly share that out on Metropolis as well. Thank you so much. I have an interesting question here about well, I should first acknowledge that we hit the top of our scheduled program. We're going to take just one question more, and it's actually, I think, a question from Laurie. She asks, how do we create a pipeline so that we can have, more architects with disabilities, or architects who are sensitive to concerns of vulnerable populations joining architecture firms? So, what do we do at the education level? And maybe Bess, you want to take this first, but I'd love to hear from the other panelists as well.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about this a little bit from the standpoint of, having taught some students. I mean, I would mainly say, this is already happening. The generation of up and coming architects and designers who are in school now are much more likely to be out about disabilities that might previously have been, hidden away or discouraged. And I think it still remains, and my colleague at Columbia, whose name I'm forgetting right now, David, last name I can't remember, has talked about this at Columbia School of Architecture in terms of the inaccessibility of architectural education, requirements such as like you can't be an architect unless you visited the Parthenon in person, that kind of thing, you know, that these sorts of mythologies I think still exist. One of the conversations that I like to ask architects is, what does an accessible crit or accessible studio environment look like? You know, an environment where maybe it's not considered an absolute necessity to stay up all night and compete and tear each other down and in critiques. Like these aspects of architectural culture, I see as some of the big barriers to diversifying across the board. What keep architecture as still one of the more exclusive professions. So I think those are the questions, and I will put out a challenge there. I have yet to see a US design institution distinguish itself as an inclusive place for the design students, right? It's like, that's the place I want to go because I want to work with disabled colleagues. I want to work with disabled faculty. I want to get to know these issues at the core. There is no US design institution that has distinguished itself that way. You guys can correct me if you find this to be wrong, but I think that's a real opportunity to like set the bar high.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'd love to propose that there are scholarships for students of diversity, but to my knowledge, no scholarships that support students whose diversity is disability. And I'd like to encourage the inception of something like that would help those students feel extra supported, I think.
Right.
It's a great idea. Right, like there are different institutions for architects in college, for designers of color, right? There might not be one. And that's an opportunity where we get to interact with colleges when we get asked to join a critique, say for NOMA. We have several of our young architects who are very involved in that, and having an opportunity to interact with other focus groups would be amazing.
Right. NOMA is, of course, then. Go ahead, Vanna.
Go ahead. Oh, I was just going to say that those types of interactions also give us a chance to get to know students and up-and-coming architects, and we're always looking for a more broad spectrum of architects to have in our firm that more widely represent our community. And so getting that chance to interact with people on that level is a great opportunity for us.
Right. Vanna, in addition to that, can you reflect a little bit on sort of Bess's question about architecture culture? I know we're super at our last minute here, but I just want to just hear you pick that up, because I know that at Lady Matham Stacy, that culture of what your office is and how you work with team members in your office is also important. And I think that is part of, you know, how you're able to deal with vulnerable populations, because, you know, you are trying to undo some of the, you know, more, my word, not yours, toxic aspects of architecture culture. So if you can just talk about the culture at Lady Matham Stacy just for a second, and then I think that we'll let that be our last comments for this afternoon.
Sure. So, you know, we're a self-selecting group. Our tagline is that we do mission-driven design. So we bring in people who are interested or passionate about a mission. You know, design is the second word, mission-driven design. We don't separate the two, but the mission's at the front. And hopefully we're known for good design. Hopefully that's not saying that takes a second seat. We're just saying that this is what is to brings people in and is our commonality. We really value studio atmosphere. We have tons of design pinups of different scales, different forms for sharing ideas. We have our colleagues do different lunch and learns for us, so it's a constant sharing of ideas. And it's been pretty interesting during this pandemic to take our studio space where we pin up idea boards all over the office, and now switch to, you know, different digital platforms that we can all access all day long, with still sharing design ideas. Keeping that sort of creative culture going in this isolation has been, I've been surprised at how much we can do, but it still lacks that in-person richness, I would say.
Right. Thank you so much. We are almost 10 minutes past our scheduled end of the program. Thank you so much to our panelists, Bess Williamson from the School of Arts Institute of Chicago, Karen Breitmeyer from Studio Pacifica, and Vanna Whitney from Lady Maitland Stacey Architects for taking the time with us, for answering our panelists, answering our attendees' questions, and for really talking through some really difficult topics, and for giving us a whole bunch of provocations. Starting next week, those of you who are used to a Tuesday schedule from Metropolis for its webinars, we're going to shake up our schedule a little bit. Next week is all about sustainability. We are taking our trademark biannual perspective sustainability program online. So those of you who are interested in debating questions about sustainability, equity among them, please join us. Registrations are now open. You can find the link quite easily at metropolismag.com. Please join us for those sessions. We're going to be talking about new technologies and sustainability. We're going to be talking about adaptive reuse. And then we're also going to be talking about resources like water as a pathway to more equitable design. As part of those conversations, we are also offering 2 demonstrations. So we're going to have people from Material Bank, from EC3, which is the Embodied Carbon in Construction Calculator, as well as from ARC, USGBC's new building performance analysis tool, give demonstrations to attendees. All sessions are free, of course, and CU accredited both with the AIA and IDCEC. So join us next week for that. In August, we're going to start a new series. Our think tank program is going to Thursdays. So if you're used to joining us on Tuesdays, we're going to be on Thursdays at this time, 3:30 p.m. Eastern time, with a series of panel discussions with firms from around the country. More details on that are also on metropolismag.com. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our panelists for all the time that you've spent with us. We truly appreciate it. Please take a look at the resources that our panelists have shared and that my colleagues have shared. We hope that this will inspire you to start to question how your own practice can become more inclusive, accessible, and equitable. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on Design TV for this special programming to mark Metropolis's 40th anniversary. Remember, as architects and designers, you have the power to make a positive impact in the world, whether it's through addressing the climate crisis, whether it's through creating inclusive and accessible spaces for everyone, supporting the health and well-being of everyone on this planet, or fighting for social justice, for opportunities for the most vulnerable amongst us. It's been a wonderful 40 years at Metropolis, but there's a lot more for us to do in the next 40 years. Thank you.